The Fermi Paradox remains one of the greatest mysteries of the universe. The galaxy is well old enough to have been entirely colonized, or at least visited by now. So, Fermi asked, where is everyone? This has led to many proposed solutions to that paradox, ranging from intelligent life simply being very rare, to aliens hiding their existence from us. But there is also another group of solutions that are quite unsettling, and even spooky, to the point that if we ever do find out the reality of the paradox, we may wish we hadn't. My guest today has compiled a list of the proposed solutions to the Fermi Paradox, and we talked specifically about the spookiest ones.
Welcome to Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Stephen Webb. Dr. Webb is the author of numerous popular science books, including Measuring the Universe, The Cosmological Distance Ladder, as well as If the Universe is Teeming with Aliens, Where is Everybody? 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox and the Problem of Extraterrestrial Life. Dr. Webb earned his PhD in Theoretical Particle Physics at the University of Manchester. His many interests include 50s sci-fi, football, cosmology, and astrobiology.
Stephen Webb, welcome to the program. Now, Stephen, there is one area of the solutions to the Fermi Paradox that sort of make you wonder if, or at least makes me wonder if we really want to know the answer. And this is things like machine civilizations that may have once been biological or made by something biological, but just does not interact with us because it does not care about the biological. It only cares about the technological. Therefore, there may be essentially like the Mass Effect game. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it had this concept of reavers that their whole reason to exist was to convert life to be machines, and then that the reason we don't see it is because they don't want us to know that they're there, and that someday they'll pounce on us. So what are some of the solutions that get into that, the spooky territory that, this galaxy may actually be rather dangerous?
Well, you mentioned danger. There's actually a lot of different types of danger, I think. So there's natural phenomena that pose dangers. Supernovae, gamma ray bursts, and so on. There's just planetary phenomena that pose dangers to civilizations. Are planets climatically stable over sufficient times? We know Earth has undergone various mass extinctions. So there are natural events. And of course, there's the possibility that life itself, or technological life, is self-limiting. And we look at what we're doing to the planet, and you can easily imagine humans posing a threat to the future of humanity. So that's without getting into the dangers possibly posed by extraterrestrial civilizations if they exist. So one possible solution to the Fermi Paradox is that actually technological life, doesn't last very long. We'll find out, won't we, I guess, in the next few decades, whether we have a future.
Do you think we will? What's your gut feeling on the future of the human species? Do you think we will make it and get past this? I have a tendency to say I think we will. I don't think we face any insurmountable problems. Difficult problems, yes, but not insurmountable. What's your view?
I'm with you, and it comes, I think, partly from that early exposure to science fiction. So Asimov's Foundation trilogy, for instance, it's part of my mental background that we will survive and we will get out there. And yes, we will always have difficult problems, but I think we have the capacity to solve them. I hope. So I'm with you. I'm an optimist. But one of the paths, one of the technological paths into the future that we can possibly foresee is the creation of, I think you called it a technological life form or technological non-biological civilization. And that worries many people, this idea of artificial intelligence. If it reaches a level of power and potency and puissance that threatens us, and it has motivations of which we are unaware or don't fully understand, then potentially what we're bringing into being is a threat to ourselves. It's another way that biological life form, in any case, might be self-limiting. We might give rise to children that take our place. It doesn't in itself resolve the Fermi Paradox, because if these very potent organisms, or well, they're not organisms, they're silicon-based, presumably, life forms, if they exist, where are they? It becomes then more difficult, though, because we don't really have a full understanding of what their motivations might be. One of the arguments that Stephen Gillette made in that original article I read is that biological life forms have this almost requirement, almost this inbuilt requirement to breed, to populate more and more of a particular niche. And why would that stop? At the planetary level, wouldn't we want to go out and get out into the galaxy? Whether that sort of motivation would carry over into some sort of machine-based civilization, I don't know. You can imagine, though, a machine-based civilization thinking, well, actually, there's all of this real estate out there. There's all of this time in which a civilization, another machine-based civilization, could have colonized the galaxy. Actually, we'd better claim our stake quickly, and we go and do that. And we get out. We're the first civilization to go out and colonize the galaxy. So if that sort of thinking takes place, that we might be the first, therefore we stake our claim, then maybe, yes, what we find is a wave of colonization that takes place not through biological civilizations, but from these artificial civilizations. So that's quite a worrying thing, isn't it? That actually we might have these berserkers, for instance, from a Fred Saberhagen science fiction story. The machines, essentially, that go out and take over.
Now,
that's a worry.
That's a worry, and one wonders too, that is that a solution that everyone is listening but no one is transmitting, and that the civilizations that transmit get destroyed by whatever may silently control the galaxy. So that to me, I think, is the most terrifying one, is that there's something lurking out there, therefore no one says anything.
Yes, and it's been the basis of some interesting stories in recent years, and what a terrifying prospect that is, isn't it? That actually no one is willing to put their head above the parapet.
It's kind of one of the things that Segnin Shklovsky, hard to pronounce his name, advanced, was that if you look for plutonium, and I know you mentioned this in your book, that something that unnatural, sure, it does occur in very minor quantities, maybe in certain situations like natural nuclear reactors, but if you saw plutonium in a star in large amounts, that might be a technosignature, and in fact there actually is a candidate for that, Chelyabinsk star. But it also says, we have advanced nuclear technology enough to where we can populate our star with plutonium. Stay away from us. So you kind of wonder if you could interpret certain things within SETI that says, well, maybe we really should not be proactively contacting anyone, and ban METI, essentially.
Absolutely, and that's an interesting question, isn't it? So we have this idea of SETI, search for extraterrestrial intelligence, but there's also METI, messaging extraterrestrial intelligence, and it again throws up not just technological questions but ethical questions. I mean, who speaks for Earth, who should be responsible for these sorts of signals. And we're reaching the stage, I think, aren't we? We won't be too far off, where individual billionaires actually can decide, well, I'll send a signal. And that worries me, that we have a society where individuals, or we will have soon, where individuals might take it upon themselves to do this.
Or a rogue nation state.
Indeed.
If you actually detected something and published it, then a rogue nation state could say, well, we're going to send the first message.
Indeed, yeah. Which I think indicates that we need to think about these things. You could argue about the relative risk or not, but I think it's certainly a question that should be debated and not just left to individuals or the possibility of rogue nation states doing whatever it is that they want to do. So yes, it raises, I think, ethical questions.
Now, the last thing that I want to get to is an idea related to convergent evolution. We see things happening on Earth, evolutionarily speaking. For example, sharks being shaped very similar to dolphins and things like that because of the utility of it to evolving a species seems to be, it produces the same result. Now, presumably this would be the same for any other carbon-based, water-based civilization. So that brings up a question. Another solution to the Fermi Paradox is that what if planets are more likely to be ocean worlds with no land and only aquatic life, where that life could be intelligent, but try mastering fire underwater, or building a car with fins. Now, do you see that as a viable solution, that we just have special circumstances with this planet that has a certain amount of land and a certain amount of ocean, but that probably isn't going to be the case for other exoplanets? What's your view?
Well, we have this large number out there, the large number of planets, and I'm sure that there will be rocky planets out there that are similar to Earth, with a similar ratio of ocean to land. I think what you've raised there is an interesting question about what exactly is it that we're looking for. So you can imagine a water world where there's intelligent life forms, but they're not going to build a radio telescope. They're not going to master fire. They're not going to have technology in the way that we have technology, because they won't have the natural resources available to them. So they will live their lives doing whatever it is that they do to survive on that planet. We're all making our way in the universe in whatever way we can, but they're not going to do what we do. And I think there's a sense in which that search for extraterrestrial intelligence is actually a search for ourselves. We're looking for creatures that are tool makers, that they're social creatures, because if you're going to cross the universe or send a signal across the universe, typically that's going to be the product of a society. They develop high level of technology, they develop a complex grammar in which they can discuss these sorts of questions about the nature of intelligence on other planets. They are intelligent themselves, and I don't see much evidence here on Earth that intelligence is some sort of convergent evolutionary process. I mean, you look at humankind's cousins, the Denisovans and the Neanderthals, high level of intelligence. They had some technological ability. Didn't do them any good. We're looking for creatures that develop science and mathematics. So it's very, very, very specialized what we're looking at when we're looking for extraterrestrial intelligence. I think in some ways we're looking for creatures that are so like ourselves and yet will share nothing with us except prebiotic chemistry. I find that slightly strange, a slightly strange expectation that we have, that we should see those sorts of creatures out there. I'm not saying that we wouldn't see all sorts of weird and wonderful types of life forms out there, but whether they have evolved the ability to disturb the universe in a way that I think that we will in the future, I find it unlikely that we will.
Now, doesn't that give us a clue, though? Animal intelligence here on Earth. There are many different intelligent animals that exist that aren't really all that related to us, such as octopuses. Does that give us an insight? Does their behavior say, well, aliens might be very similar in a certain way, and ultimately, if an alien civilization can build a radio transmitter, then they must, on some level, be fairly like us in some way, right?
Well, I think if you flip it, that yes, I think there would have to be something in common. If we detected a radio signal that was a list of the first few dozen prime numbers, for instance, or some decimal representation of pi, or whatever it happens to be, then I think that in itself would tell us an awful lot. Not just the fact of their existence, but the fact of their interpretation and understanding of the world is rather similar to our own. All of that reading of science fiction when I was young drives me to think that actually if we were to find alien life, it would be alien, it would be different, it would have evolved in response to quite different evolutionary pressures. You mentioned life around a red dwarf, for example. If we found life there, I would bet it would be very, very, very different to life here on Earth. And I would be astounded if we ever got radio signals from a planet orbiting that sort of star. If we did, I think it would tell us something incredibly profound. I think more likely would be that if we detected a signal, we would again face almost that philosophical question of what does that signal mean? What is it that they're trying to say? I think there would be some doubt over whether it actually was a signal. I think there'd be a debate about, is it a signal?
Or was it hoaxed by Earthlings?
Indeed, yeah. Which raises a whole other question. The initial detection of gravitational waves, one of the things that ran through the discoverers' minds was, is this a hoax? Is this malicious? Has someone injected a signal to make us look foolish or just for malicious purposes? So I think if we did find something, actually, there would be intense discussion about what exactly is it that we've found.
And it could be maddening, because if the radio astronomers come and say, we've detected a signal that's unambiguous, and everybody's like, well, what's it say? And they're like, we don't know, it's radar. The aliens have radar. And they're like, well, what else do we know about this civilization? Well, nothing, essentially. And it could be centuries before we glean anything else out about this civilization we've discovered. So it could be maddening.
It would be potentially totally maddening. I mean, they're so far away you can't share a knock-knock joke with them. So you're just reliant on whatever it is that's coming your way, potentially for a long, long time. Now, great if we receive a beacon and then we point our telescopes at the beacon and then we start getting their Encyclopedia Galactica. Tremendous. I suspect that first signal, if we ever were to have it, would be maddening, as you say, rather than enlightening. Some
internal communication between their ships, and we can't decipher it. We have no way to know what it is.
Potentially that, or potentially something like the wow signal that we mentioned earlier, that we think, was that it? Was it not? What was that?
I kind of expect that, but there is some, unambiguous things that we could see.
Yes.
It would be hard, laser communication or something like that. We wouldn't really be able to decipher it, but it really couldn't be produced by nature.
Yes.
Or at least in a certain way, if it happened in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't even mentioned optical SETI, which is a whole other approach, and it has its advantages, definitely. Has its disadvantages, narrow beams and so on, but yes, optical SETI. I think we have to just accept that this is a difficult problem and we might not live to see a resolution, but all we can do is, I think, keep on trying, keep on looking, but maybe broadening our search just on the off chance, because it is such a difficult problem. I think we need to, well, A, invest more in it, but B, look perhaps in ways that we haven't thought to look before.
And that's interesting because in this age, as you mentioned earlier, the age of the billionaires funding things, we now have private, well, we've always, at least for the last 25 years, had private individuals doing things like building the Allen Telescope Array, or giving seed money or whatever, and also with Breakthrough Listen. So we have this option now where private searches for SETI could become far more common than they already are, and we might be able to look more efficiently and in new ways, such as using the spectrograph to look for CFCs or the vegetative red edge or all these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to bring up one other solution to the Fermi Paradox, and that is that we are early in the game. Maybe it's the opposite of what we discussed, where maybe we're first in this galaxy, and you mentioned that, which would mean that we would sort of be the ancient ones, the definers of the Milky Way galaxy. And if we spread out into it, space is vast, we might never do it, but if we did, we might do things like, to go into science fiction, David Brin, Uplifting, where we find these locked in intelligent creatures on worlds that they can't get off of, and we can help them. Say they have a gravity well that's too big for rockets or something like that. What's your view on that? Do you think that we should even do that, or should we just leave things as they are?
You mentioned science fiction, and that the long-term implication, if we are the first, then yes, we need to consider that. But it's actually, I think, a live question, isn't it? Because we will be exploring Mars increasingly in the next few decades. I'm sure there will be missions to the moons of those giant planets. We're not going to find advanced technological civilizations on those objects, but it's possible that we might find life. And I think we have to be very careful right now about the protocols for exploring our immediate neighborhood. Even actually here on Earth, if we were looking for the shadow biosphere, and we might, for instance, go, I don't know, to Antarctica and start deep drilling, reaching places that have been isolated from the rest of the environment for tens of millions of years. I think in all of these situations, actually, it's a real current cause for concern that we don't want to go polluting otherwise pristine environments that might mask a potential signature. We need to be absolutely sure that any life we find out there originated there, and it wasn't brought by us by accident to these places. So I think it's actually more of a current concern than those far off science fictional scenarios that you mentioned. We need to be thinking about it actually right now.
Yeah, especially you mentioned places in Antarctica like sealed off lakes and things like that have been, isolated for so long that they might be perfect places to look for a shadow biosphere. Now, my last question for you is, there was a paper, a couple of years ago now, I think, that laid out the case that we might not just be alone in this galaxy, and alone as a result of the time in which we live in this galaxy, but we might be utterly alone entirely in the universe permanently. Do you think that's too cynical of a solution to the Fermi Paradox, that we are utterly, absolutely alone always?
Cynical, I wouldn't say. My preferred solution to the paradox would be that we share a universe with beings with whom we can one day communicate. I think that would be tremendously exciting. It would not surprise me, though, if it turns out that we are ultimately, fundamentally alone. It would be somewhat, I think, spooky if we look out to the vastness of the universe and it turns out to be just us. But it would not necessarily surprise me that we are the only conscious, sentient, intelligent beings in the galaxy, or indeed even the universe.
And perhaps that makes it the spookiest solution of all, that we are absolutely alone. Why is that? And I don't think we would ever be able to answer that question.
No, it would be strange. Strange indeed.
1 billion years from now, we would still be asking, why are we alone? All right, Doctor, thank you for joining us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. And when you release the next edition of the book, I hope you'll come back and visit us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
So what do you think the solution to the Fermi Paradox is? Do you think we should be worried? Let us know in the comments below. Next week, we'll delve back into the other solutions to the Fermi Paradox with part 2 of my interview with Stephen Webb. He has compiled over 75 of them. See you then.
John, you haven't told the viewers to subscribe for ages.
Like, subscribe, and share. The big problem with the Fermi Paradox is that we really don't know what all of the rules of life are in the universe. We're in some ways an infant civilization, unsure if we'll even be around in 500 years, much less tens of thousands of years where we might become an easily detectable civilization to the rest of the galaxy, perhaps millions of years to be detectable outside it. This has led to the deep question of what the solution to the Fermi Paradox actually is. On one end of the spectrum, we are simply alone right now and can't detect anyone else that might be out there. They don't exist at the same time as us, or aren't close enough for us to see. Yet on the other end of the spectrum, they might be everywhere, and we cannot or are not allowed to see them. It's anyone's guess, and that leads us to something my guest has been studying for decades: the many possible solutions to the Fermi Paradox.
You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier.
Stephen Webb, welcome to the program.
John, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Now, Stephen, you wrote one of the a book that's very close to my own heart because I've been intensely interested in the Fermi Paradox for decades. And in this book, If the Universe is Teeming with Aliens, Where is Everybody? 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox and the Problem of Extraterrestrial Life. Now, 75 solutions to the Fermi Paradox. That's amazing. Since this edition of the book, which I believe is 2015, have you come up with any more?
It's not me that's come up with them. It's the community. One of the fascinating aspects I find of the Fermi Paradox is that it is so productive. It brings in so many different aspects of science, of even sociological thinking. So the community as a whole has come up with solutions since 2015, and it's strange that you mention it because a couple of months ago the publishers said it's been 5 years. What about a third edition? And as you know, I got into the habit as a young man of collecting these, and sure enough, since 2015 there have been other solutions proposed. So there will be, I think, a third edition, but it would be awful to call it 100 solutions. It started off with 50, then that was the first edition, then it became 75. I think everyone, including myself, would lose the will to live if I just give 100. So it'll be a slightly different approach. I think I'd like to look into the motivations, perhaps, of the people who are proposing these ideas, and perhaps take a slightly more general approach. But I can walk you through some of the solutions, if you wish, that have been proposed.
Absolutely.
So let's go with gravitational waves, for example. So I wrote a book a few years ago about the incredible new observatories that are going to come online. They've started to come online. There'll be more in the next few years. We're entering a golden age of astronomy and cosmology. And one of the chapters, this is about 8 years ago, was about gravitational wave observatories. And back then I was still unsure whether we would ever actually detect gravitational waves, because physicists had been promising me that for decades. It hadn't come. It was an incredibly difficult technological challenge that the astronomers had set themselves. So I wrote that chapter back then thinking, well, maybe not. About 2 years after that book was published, LIGO and Virgo detected gravitational waves. I now have an app on my phone that alerts me to the latest gravitational wave detection when neutron stars have merged and in the distant universe and been detected. The ripples in space have been detected by Virgo or LIGO. It's incredible increase in technology in those short few years.
Indeed.
Well, people have said maybe truly advanced civilizations recognize that if you can detect electromagnetic waves, then you can detect gravitational waves. Now that seems crazy because it's incredibly difficult to detect gravitational waves, right? But there are plenty of people still alive who were born before the first radio telescope was created. So from the perspective of an advanced extraterrestrial civilization, who's perhaps thousands, millions, even a billion years in advance of us, that timescale between finding radio waves and having a radio telescope and detecting gravitational waves, it's an eye blink. It just is no time at all. So they could reasonably suspect that if you can detect radio waves, then you could detect gravitational waves. So people have said, well, maybe that's how extraterrestrials would send a signal. It's really difficult to send a signal, but one paper I read recently, I think it's still in preprint, but the idea is that an advanced civilization says, what's the unique place in the galaxy when it comes to gravitational waves? Well, that is Sagittarius A*, it's the central supermassive black hole in the galaxy. And the unique part of that object is the innermost stable circular orbit. So you get a massive object, a star, say, and you feed it with energy. So you put it in that innermost stable circular orbit, feed it with energy so it doesn't just get sucked in beyond the event horizon into the black hole. You keep it there. You can keep it there for billions of years, and it will constantly radiate gravitational waves of a particular frequency. So you don't get that chirp of gravitational wave increase in frequency as you get within spiraling neutron stars, for example. It's a constant frequency gravitational wave. If they did that, and we could relatively easily detect it with the next generation of detectors like LISA, space-based observatory, then you'd immediately know something was up. So there's this idea of a gravitational wave beacon. And I'd certainly want to explore that, I think, in more detail in a book.
Now, it would seem to me that with a gravitational wave, that would get past some of the problems inherent with radio, SETI, in that everyone would detect the gravitational wave unambiguously, correct?
Absolutely. So it's this idea of omnidirectional signaling to the entire galaxy. Absolutely. It's just one of the advantages. The disadvantage is it requires an incredible amount of energy to do that. So we're talking about civilizations that far in advance of our own. But they've had time to develop.
But millions of years, even conceivably, you know, billions of years.
Absolutely.
And you talk about that in both your book and your TED Talk, that, you know, this galaxy has had a lot of time to develop a civilization. Give us some sort of scale on that.
Well, I think that's the crux of the paradox, isn't it? So on the one hand, the galaxy is big, by which I mean it can contain a lot of stuff, a lot of planets, a lot of places where life could get going. So naively, and perhaps not even naively, you would expect, by the Copernican principle, this idea that there's nothing special about Earth, you would expect lots of planets to have life, and at least some of those planets to be home to intelligence and perhaps technologically advanced civilizations. So the galaxy is big, but on the other hand, yes, the galaxy is old. We know that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, give or take. And there doesn't seem to be a fundamental reason why those civilizations could not be billions of years in advance of our own. And it is difficult to get a handle on how long a billion years is. But if you compress the age of the universe into 1 year, then all of the interesting stuff that's happening here on Earth takes place in the last weeks of December, and all the really, really interesting stuff, you know, stuff involving intelligence, that takes place just before midnight, really, 31st December in the year. That's where we are right now. But those civilizations, they could be popping up in the summer months. So there seems to be plenty of time for civilizations if they follow the same technological arc as we do. And again, by that Copernican principle, if you say that there's nothing special about us, and you know, we came into being on an ordinary planet, therefore other beings could come into being on an ordinary planet, there's nothing to stop them advancing technologically in the way that we've advanced. But they just have more time to achieve incredible things. And if a billion years presumably would allow enough time for civilizations to develop a level of technology that, you know, Arthur Clarke would say was indistinguishable from magic.
In such a situation, and we have the Kardashev scale to sort of, you know, general guide on what this might look like. So if you have a type 3 civilization that is, I mean, we certainly see no evidence of anything like that, but we don't know necessarily what one would look like. It's usually assumed that they'd be building Dyson spheres or something, but they very well may not be. You know, they may take some of their form. So would it be within the power of such a civilization, as Kardashev laid out with type 3, to use gravitational waves as a form of communication like that? I mean, would that be not a big deal for that kind of a civilization, or would it still be a problem even at that level?
For Kardashev 3, they could so if you run the numbers, for instance, with the particular scenario that I mentioned, which is putting an object, say the size of Jupiter, in that innermost stable circular orbit of the supermassive black hole at the center of our galaxy, then the energy associated with keeping it there is large, but it's sort of on the order of the energy output associated with a stellar object over the period of its life. So it's not outlandishly large, and a K3 civilization, you might imagine, would have access to that sort of energy resource. You could ask yourself, would they use it in that way? Why, if they've got access to such large energy reserves, why would they do that? But that's a separate question. Technologically, it would be possible for them to do it. The problem with that particular scenario, having a Jupiter, say, a Jupiter-sized mass, is that something like that, or a star, would be tidally disrupted. So it couldn't actually be that sort of object. You'd need a white dwarf with sufficient structural integrity, as it were, to stand up to those gravitational tidal interactions and maintain its integrity. But a white dwarf would require incredible amounts of energy to keep it there over a long period of time. Or you say, well, can they somehow compactify Jupiter so that it becomes an incredibly dense small object? You still get the gravitational waves because it's the same mass as it's going around this innermost stable circular orbit. But how on earth would they compactify Jupiter? So either way, we're talking about civilizations that have access to energy resources and access to technology that we just don't really understand, but we can certainly imagine it, and there doesn't seem to be anything in the laws of physics that absolutely forbids it. So we're in the realms of imagining things. Whether these are ever practical or not, we can argue, and that's part of the fun of the paradox, isn't it?
Oh, of course. Now, what are some of the other options that don't involve radio or laser? What about neutrinos? Can we see any utility to communicating that way, if it's even possible?
It's another option. It's, again, in that book I talked about neutrino astronomy, and I was, again, slightly... There are problems with that. Neutrinos are great in that they go almost as fast as light, and in certain circumstances a neutrino signal gets here before light does. I'm thinking of things like supernovae, where light itself from deep within the star struggles to leave the explosion, but as soon as a neutrino is created, it's off because it doesn't interact much with matter, so it's off. The fact that neutrinos just leave the scene of the crime, as it were, is tantamount to saying it's incredibly difficult to detect them, and it's incredibly difficult to modulate them for a signal. So yes, we can imagine neutrinos carrying a signal very, very quickly, and because they don't have an electric charge, they go where you would want them to. But it requires, again, a level of technology that makes you think, would civilizations go to that bother? It's difficult to modulate the signal. It's difficult to know where the signal comes from and to detect. I personally would favor gravitational waves over neutrinos, but I was wrong about gravitational waves several years ago, so I might well be wrong about that.
Now, the case can be made too, though, that, one of the earliest things that humans developed was fire, and actually proto-humans, pre-humans. Yet we still use fire, and there are probably many more fires of artificial origin burning on this planet right now than there have ever been in human history. So that it may be that radio is just so useful that even the biggest civilizations, oldest civilizations, most advanced civilizations still use it. And we look for it, but we don't see it, except maybe in one case. What's your opinion of the wow signal?
That's interesting. It's such a... So first of all, just to step back, I think you're right to make that point. It's all... There's the modernity bias. Maybe we can discuss that later. But as a community and scientists in general, we tend to look at the new thing. That's the interesting thing to investigate, to research. So I just mentioned gravitational waves. Everyone's thinking about these things because we've just detected them. But actually, I think you're dead right. Radio is very, very easy to create. Civilizations out there, if they exist, would know that other civilizations can easily detect radio. It has its own problems in terms of, do you go omnidirectional versus beamed and all that sort of stuff. But radio is almost a lowest common denominator, I think. So absolutely we should be looking in the radio. As for the wow, how frustrating is it that potentially we have a signal? It meets all the criteria that you might expect, but it's a one-off. And I think in the absence of anything else to verify it, you would probably be looking for some sort of mundane, everyday explanation. What that is, I don't know, but I wouldn't bet the house on that being a signal from an extraterrestrial civilization. The tantalizing, frustrating thing is, well, it could have been. How frustrating is that?
Extremely. The wow signal is probably the one thing in astronomy that bothers me. I think about it a lot because there's just certain things. And I actually interviewed Jerry Eamon recently, who was the scientist who wrote WOW on the paper. And it's just very perplexing, but unless it repeats, we're never going to know.
Yes, yeah. That's the awful the awful thing about that sort of signal. We have to be careful that just because we don't immediately understand something, we immediately think, oh, aliens, and that's a logical leap that many people make, and they shouldn't. So it's things like, I don't know, fast radio bursts, puzzling phenomenon, but we'll get there. We'll get this understanding of it eventually. That's the interesting part of science, isn't it? Figuring out things. But the wow signal, yes, because it is that single intriguing event, it is just so tantalizing.
Now that leads us to another area of solutions, because one would be that all we ever pick up are wow signals. And if you look at the history of our planet, the signals that we produce that might be easily seen by another SETI experiment in the galaxy are things like when we radar asteroids using Arecibo and it doesn't repeat. Nor did any of our messages that we sent, the Arecibo signal, never repeated it. So it could simply be that everyone lives in a state of question mark. What was that? Was that another civilization? And yet nobody ever really does a concerted effort to contact anyone. What are some of the other solutions like that, where it's just simply ships passing in the night and missing each other?
Well, that if it turns out that describes the galaxy, I think it would be just so lonely and such a frustrating situation. It might actually turn out to be the case, because SETI is incredibly hard, isn't it? The search for extraterrestrial intelligence. If you're going to go via radio, you have to be looking at the right time. So civilizations, if they pop in and out of existence, we don't know how long our own civilization is going to last. So you need civilizations to be around at the same time, taking into account light travel distance between them. You have to point your radio telescope in the right direction, assuming that they're beaming. You have to have it tuned to the right frequency. You have to be looking at for the right sort of signal. There's a vast space to explore. And yes, it's entirely possible that, as you said, you have these things dipping off here and there, and only occasionally do the two things, the signal and the receiver, align. And it's, as you say, ships passing in the night. But there are other ways of disturbing the universe, if you like, in a way that can make your presence felt. So it doesn't have to be just radio. You could, if you were a civilization and you wanted, for instance, to send out your Encyclopedia Galactica, decide that actually radio isn't the best way of doing it, because who's going to pick it up? Let's send probes. So you can actually physically send self-replicating probes to deposit your Encyclopedia Galacticas, or try and colonize if that's the way you're inclined. So the Fermi Paradox is not just that we don't hear or see them out there. There's also this aspect that none of them have bothered to use any other means of contact, seemingly, and I'm thinking by probe. And again, since we're in the realm of imagination, it's easy to imagine scenarios whereby a civilization can colonize the galaxy, or distribute its Encyclopedia Galactica to all planets in the galaxy on a relatively small timescale. So the paradox for me is that there's absolutely no indication, apart from perhaps things like the WOW signal, there's no indication yet of life out there in the universe. But yeah, if we're just talking about radio, it's a difficult task that SETI astronomers have set themselves.
Now, in regards to self-replicating probes, idea originally by John von Neumann, these wouldn't necessarily be the easiest things to find in your solar system if there is one present. So if it's not transmitting to us, say it's only transmitting home and not in our direction, we would never even know it was there, right?
So we're getting into those sort of classes of solution that say that yes, they exist and they're here and they're perhaps monitoring us. So there's this whole idea of the zoo scenario. So absolutely, if technology is so advanced that they can send these probes, it will be advanced enough to ensure that we don't spot them if they don't want to be seen. I think, and maybe it's an opinion that's not widely shared, but I think that if a civilization was advanced enough to do that, it wouldn't have anything to fear from other civilizations. So I don't see that there's necessarily any benefit to keeping itself hidden. But if it wanted to, for whatever reason, prime directive as Star Trek and all that sort of stuff, then yes, you're right, it certainly could. And it would be difficult to observe these things. Having said that, a couple of years ago, there was all the interest over Oumuamua, and we have the second interstellar visitor,
Borisov.
Yes, it's here right now. Well, beginning to leave, isn't it? There's, and again, going back to this idea of new observatories, there's an incredible new observatory going to come online in the next year or two. It's now called the Vera Rubin telescope, was the Large Synoptic Survey telescope.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
I hadn't heard that they... Oh, that's neat. I hadn't heard they decided to name it that, but I am so excited for that.
Yeah,
telescope.
yes, absolutely. It's great, isn't it? And yeah, just so well deserved. So the observatory is the Vera Rubin observatory, and that is going to be an incredible instrument, and it will be capable of detecting, because of the way it's observing the universe, it will be capable of detecting a whole load of these interstellar visitors, things like Oumuamua and so on. And if you combine that with advances in sort of machine learning, so astronomy is not just increasing in the sense that it's getting these incredible observatories. Machine learning and artificial intelligence is letting us analyze these huge data sets in ways that just are impossible for humans. So it opens up another approach, I think, to SETI, and I think it's important that we broaden the approach. It's not just radio. Yes, that's probably the base case, and it's the lowest common denominator, as I said, but we don't know what civilizations out there would actually do, because they would be by definition alien. And I think it's important that we broaden it as much as possible, and we look at gravitational waves and search through the data for that. We look at the data from Vera Rubin observatory when it comes, and look through that, and there's all of these different approaches that we could use, and I think it's important that we do use, that we don't prejudge, as it were, what a signal might look like. Can I give you another solution that's been proffered since that second edition of the book?
Absolutely.
Just to give you an idea of what it is I'm trying to get at. It seems an outlandish idea, but it's due to Clément Vidal, a Belgian astronomer and philosopher. And he says, look at millisecond pulsars, X-ray millisecond pulsars. They're rapidly spinning neutron stars that send off pulses. it turns out that they are ideal for a passive navigation system. And in fact, NASA has investigated it, and probably if we start exploring the outer reaches of the solar system, we'll have something like that on board the probes that we send out, because it means that the probes themselves can use these X-ray millisecond pulsars as a GPS, as a galactic positioning system. It turns out that they're ideal, these pulsars, for that sort of endeavor, and we don't have to then steer the probe from Earth.
So how would that, so an alien civilization might use that as a passive navigation system, but how would that be, how does that work into the paradox itself?
Well, I just want to highlight that as a way that Vidal says we should be approaching these massive data sets. So he says most scientists, I would be one of them, says X-ray navigation by pulsars. The pulsars themselves, entirely natural objects. It's just we happen to be clever enough to take advantage of them. You could go one step further and say, well, extraterrestrial civilizations, if they're out there, would be using them to navigate themselves. But Vidal says, well, you can look at this hypothesis on a scale. You could say that maybe advanced civilizations could modulate the signals and use it not just for navigation, but perhaps also for communication. You could go right to the end of the scale and say that these super advanced civilizations have actually created these millisecond pulsars for a GPS and communication system. If you go that route right at the end scale and say that these super advanced civilizations are going off creating supernovae to create these X-ray millisecond pulsars for their own purposes, under that hypothesis you would expect certain distribution of X-ray millisecond pulsars. You'd want them beaming preferentially in the beam, in the plane of the galaxy. You would want them, if they are an artificial GPS system, they would have certain characteristics. We could search for that. I don't believe for 1 minute that these pulsars are anything but natural, but if you take the hypothesis that they could be artificial, you can then start looking at what the hypothesis would predict and then go and test it. And so what I'm saying is that we're getting these huge data sets coming through, and I think we should be open to interrogating those data sets in a variety of different ways that might seem completely off the wall and probably won't succeed, but there's no harm in trying.
No, not by any means. You have to look. As a matter of fact, I recently had a discussion with the scientist Beatrice Villarreal, she's looking for stars that seem to unnaturally disappear, where there's no known, I'm sure she's going to find all kinds of interesting natural phenomena that can make a star dim or disappear. I mean, we've already started seeing that with Tabby star and cases like that. Mm-hmm. Yep. Well, maybe you might see one that is disappearing in a way that just isn't possible without a civilization. And it's been interesting because it just seems to me over the last 10 years, people have cooked up way more detectable technosignatures than what anyone had thought back in the days of, Cocconi and Morrison, when they said, look for radio beacons. Well, then radio beacons, omnidirectional ones, don't really make a lot of sense. But then everybody came up with a whole bunch of other ones, from looking for CFCs in an exoplanet atmosphere and all kinds of interesting stuff in recent years.
But going back to the idea of the modernity bias, it's if you go back to 19th century Gauss, one of the greatest minds in history, inevitably, he had a set of mental furniture produced by the world in which he was living, and his idea about communicating humankind's presence to Mars, in that case, would be to plant Pythagorean forests in Siberia. So you have a 3, 4, 5 triangle forest. His idea was that any Martian astronomers seeing that would immediately know that wasn't a natural phenomenon, and therefore Earth must be inhabited. That was the level of technology that was available to him, and that's how he was thinking. One of his students came up with a similar idea about digging a ditch and putting kerosene in and setting it alight. That was the technology that was available to them at the time. That's what they thought they could do. A little bit later, civilization here was almost synonymous with canalization, this idea of getting dirty water away from you and clean water to you. And as soon as that was happening in Victorian cities, people started seeing canals on Mars and coming up with romantic ideas about why that might be the case. 20th century, we invent radio, and then suddenly radio's the way to do communication across interstellar distances. 2000, everything's digital, and then people say, oh, maybe we're living in a simulation. Maybe that explains the paradox. 2015, LIGO and Virgo see gravitational waves, and then we're thinking, I'm sat here talking to you thinking, maybe gravitational waves is the way to go. So the suggestions tend to follow our technological capacity at any time, and I think it's inevitable. What else can we do? But we need to be aware, I think, of that bias, and maybe just be a little bit more humble and think, let's not prejudge. Let's try and be as flexible in our thinking as possible.
Now, speaking of biases, there are others. And another one would be that a technological civilization might be producing radio, but they're just not doing it from a star system. They might be, for some reason, not located on a planet. So that brings in a location bias where we're like, well, we live on a planet, therefore they must. And there's just no reason to say that.
I mean, you're right. I mean, there's so many biases, and it's so difficult to move away from anthropocentric thinking. I would suggest that for life to get going, it requires certain things. So, for example, it's difficult to imagine life as we know it. We always have to say life as we know it. And there is, I guess, a philosophical question involved around how do we define life? How would we recognize it, perhaps, if we go out there and see something? Indeed, is it possible that there's a shadow biosphere even here on Earth? That's another question we could investigate.
Yes, that's interesting stuff. We may have a shadow biosphere that we don't really have an easy way to detect.
Yeah. I mean, if
maybe all around us.
Yeah, I mean, if the claim is that life gets going easily, one answer to the Fermi paradox could be that actually it's an incredibly rare fluke that you get from inanimate matter to animate living material. We don't know precisely how it happened. You could say it's an incredibly rare fluke, in which case Fermi paradox solved. But if we assume it's a natural event, and some people say it's actually very easy to get from non-life to life, then you could imagine back on Earth when our abiogenesis event took place, the event that led ultimately to us, maybe there are other events that relied on different chemicals, different coding systems. And if that's the case, if you swap one of the key elements, I mean, life as we know it depends on carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur. The phosphorus actually gives rise to yet another possible answer to the problem. We maybe touch on it later. But you can imagine swapping out one of those elements for some other element. It would lead to potentially a life form that's very different to what we have. So it could be, potentially, if life gets started very, very easily, that multiple genesis events took place on Earth, and we have this shadow biosphere around us that we just don't recognize. It's possible. And again, unless we look with an open mind.
Which is hard, because
yes,
microbiology is hard. It's hard to detect.
Absolutely. None of this is easy, which again makes it fascinating.
Now, the interesting thing, I think the most interesting thing, is if we did find a shadow biosphere, it's got to be microbial, or else we'd see unrelated macrofauna walking around. But If it's microbial and say it's old as well, say its genesis happened a billion years after our type of life, came about, it brings us to one scary filter, the idea that prokaryotic and life tends to only very rarely, or perhaps uniquely, jump to eukaryotic life. And we'll get into that when we come back. We have to take a break. I'm joined today by Stephen Webb, author of 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox and the Problem of Extraterrestrial Life. Back in a moment.
John, you haven't told the viewers to subscribe for ages.
Like, subscribe, and share. And we're back with Dr. Stephen Webb. Now, Stephen, within this idea of a shadow biosphere, as we mentioned, it brings up one of the solutions to the Fermi Paradox, and it's the one that I admit I am most sympathetic to, that I wonder about, that it took a very, very long time for the simplest life on Earth, the prokaryotes, to make the leap to eukaryotic life, an extremely, very glaring amount of time. And if we did find a shadow biosphere, it would be microbial, and it never made that leap. So that might suggest that the solution to the Fermi Paradox is that intelligence is simply very, very, very rare, extraordinarily so. What's your view on that?
I think that if we did detect a shadow biosphere, or if we detected the remains of, even if it's fossilized remains of life on Mars, or if we go to Enceladus or one of these moons and discover an independent genesis event, it makes it incredibly likely that the galaxy is filled with planets where something similar has happened. I don't believe there's such a uniqueness about the solar system that it could happen multiple times in the solar system and never anywhere else. So yes, we would then expect lots of planets to have microbial life at least. But then yes, you ask this question: can we get from simple single-celled organisms to multicellular life, this prokaryotic eukaryotic transition? And there's some recent work, and the reason I'm not a microbiologist is I can never pronounce the words that they use in these species, but I believe it's called Prometheoarchaeum. They've, in the past couple of weeks, I believe it's Japanese researchers, have found evidence that this actually might have been the event, that Prometheoarchaeum had tentacles and it grabbed a passing bacterium, and then instead of that being food, that bacterium entered a symbiotic relationship and it actually provided useful energy to that Prometheoarchaeum. That could be an incredibly flukish event. So it's not just that event has to happen and that symbiosis takes place, but then it has to be such a useful thing that it spreads. And I think, yes, if I had to bet, I would guess that we probably are living in a galaxy where there are multiple places where abiogenesis took place, and that there's lots of microbial life, but that transition to a higher grade of life is relatively, probably very rare. And then in order to reach a stage of intelligent technological civilization, you have to have a variety of other things happen, one of which is a nice stable climate for billions of years, and there are reasons to suppose that Earth is flukish in that event. So then you start thinking about the number of different things that have got to go right in order to reach this end point. And I think for a long time people have been overawed by this large number in the problem when we discuss the Fermi Paradox, which is the number of places that life could have started. But we don't actually know whether that's a big number in this case. If it turns out that it's relatively flukish to go from prokaryotic grade of life to eukaryotic grade of life, if it's relatively difficult for that to take place on a planet that is then stable climatically over billions of years, and so on and so on. Personally, I think that could resolve the paradox.
And it seems a reasonable solution, because the chemistry of life is complex, of course, but it clearly is not impossible. Intelligence is a completely different thing from that. So just the chemistry part of it, even though it's complex, we're probably going to know within the next 20, 30, 40 years how that works. And we'll be able to say this is either a fluke or this is just a natural end of chemistry, of organic chemistry in a certain situation. And life, at least microbial life, will arise regularly. And again, we have two ways of finding that out. We have the scientists that are looking at the origins of life, and we also have Europa and Enceladus and all of these ice sheet moons to look at that may well have something living in them. But that's exciting to me, because that's a question that can be answered within my lifetime, whereas an alien civilization, maybe not.
Yeah, it is just such one of the frustrations, isn't it, of getting old, that there's all of these interesting scientific questions you want to live long enough to see the answer to, and some of them you think, they're going to nail that, and I'm sure biochemists will in my lifetime. There are others where I know I'm going to be on my deathbed just cursing that there are these things I'm not going to know. I mean, going back to an earlier question about new resolutions of the paradox, and I mentioned phosphorus earlier. I should say that chemically, life on Earth, again, it's life as we know it, but all life forms that we know about depend on carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And that phosphorus is actually relatively rare. And we're not 100% sure about how Earth got its phosphorus. Ultimately, it would have been cooked up in a supernova, and this is very, very tentative suggestion at present, and the astronomers who made it want follow-up time to recognize whether this is actually the case or not. But it's possible that certain supernovae are required and to explode in certain ways to deliver the phosphorus into the interstellar medium that is then later transported to a planetary system. So it's possible that this is another aspect that makes chemistry or biochemistry difficult, that you need a planetary system that was formed around the right sort of supernovae. But again, these are sorts of questions that I think we will get a better handle on over the next 10, 20, 30 years.
Now, what of alternative biochemistries? Because some people have said, well, what about silicon, or variations on, I think boron is one of them too, that maybe, and there's counts against all of them, much, much more so than carbon. But do you think it's possible that, silicon-based life that isn't a machine could possibly be out there and surmount that problem of the phosphorus rarity issue?
I don't think silicon would swap with phosphorus. There's occasionally you get claims that you can swap one thing with another, and arsenic-based life was, I was going to say, all the rage a while ago. There was a suggestion made a couple of years ago that arsenic could form the basis of a life form. It turns out that actually what it was an arsenic-tolerant organism. It still required those 6 elements. And there's no, to the best of my knowledge, no life form on Earth that doesn't require those base 6 organisms. Now, it's possible, I guess, that, again, in the next 10, 20, 30 years, biochemists will start tinkering with the basic building blocks of life, and they'll get a better handle on whether these things are required or not. My guess is actually probably yes. It's anthropocentric, I know, but there are certain properties of water, for example, that I can't imagine life doing without. Carbon, it's a very, one of my teachers once called it a very slutty element. It'll go with anyone. So it's a very, it's almost unique, not quite, but it's almost unique in its properties. So it's difficult to move away from this anthropocentric thinking, but if I had to guess, I would probably put money that if we ever find life out on other planets, it'll be based on the same sort of chemistry. It might look completely different. It might be very, very different, but basic building blocks, I suspect, will be the same. It'll be a reliance on water, it'll be a reliance on carbon, and so on. You mentioned, interestingly, silicon-based life form that's artificial. That, I think, is an interesting question. When we go out there, will we see silicon-based life that is artificial?
Yes, I made that distinction for a reason, because we will get into this later, but there may be certain scenarios where you don't want to answer the Fermi Paradox, and especially has to do with machine civilizations. However, now in regards to the chemistry of life, I had an interesting thought. So if supernovas, only of a certain type, very special supernova, will produce all that phosphorus, we know of at least one sibling of the sun that seems to chemically have formed in the same solar nebula as our sun did. Would that be an interesting indicator to look for exoplanets with life on them close by that are also siblings of the sun because they would have the phosphorus? Could a focus be put on that?
Absolutely. I think that's a tremendous idea, that we should be looking in the local neighborhood for that sort of experiment. And again, going back to this idea of credible new observatories, we can also get a handle on that sort of question about whether phosphorus, whether Earth might be special in having phosphorus and being formed around a particular type of supernova. We have the James Webb Space Telescope coming. The launch date keeps being put back.
We've waited so long.
It will get up there, I'm sure, and it is going to be a tremendous observatory, and it can answer those sorts of questions. So again, it's about waiting, but we are going to get industrial amounts of data from multiple different observatories in the next few years, and a lot of these questions, I think, will be answered. The question in my mind is it going to sharpen the Fermi Paradox? And I suspect it will. All of this data, I think.
It leads to interesting thinking. I was just, again, thinking, is that if you have a civilization that finds another civilization around a star that formed as a twin of sorts in the same solar nebula created by the same supernova, are they actually really aliens?
Yeah. Well, what an interesting thought. We are here on Earth. We are all life is interrelated. We will share, if we ever find life, we will share only prebiotic chemistry, presumably, with that civilization, unless we were seeded deliberately. I mean, that's another possibility, isn't it? That directed panspermia, that there was a unique civilization that deliberately seeded planets with life, in which case, yes, we would be connected. But assuming we just share prebiotic chemistry, I think there are ethical questions involved. Would we somehow be closer to those life forms than life forms that formed around some other supernovae elsewhere in the galaxy? An interesting question. I've never really thought about it.
One could also ask, too, that what effect does this type of star that you live around have on the evolution of your species? So if you have another civilization that evolved around a sun-like star, they might bear similarities to us as opposed to a civilization around a much darker star, say a red dwarf. And I know there are problems with red dwarfs and habitable zones, but say it's possible. Life there may look radically different, akin in some way maybe, but it would appear radically different, and you would have, I don't know, much bigger plant-like things or something like that can collect much more light, or light at different wavelengths that the star's producing, or maybe it evolved to use ultraviolet. Which brings us to another question. If a civilization decides, there are stars that are wholly unsuitable for life to appear around. we'll use Betelgeuse as an example because it's currently acting up. You would not expect to find any planets or anything at Betelgeuse. So therefore, you're not going to point a radio telescope towards it, at least for SETI purposes. But could such a thing be more useful for an alien civilization, or a black hole for that matter? Could they be getting their energy from a black hole where we normally just wouldn't look, and that we're just missing them? And or could it be that life, I remember there was a concept of Dyson sunflowers where life can presumably exist in space itself. So this again gets into biases. Do you think that we should probably alter our strategy in SETI to look at those types of scenarios a little bit more than is being done? Because as far as I know, it's not being done.
Yes. So you mentioned that earlier, and I went off on a tangent, as I tend to do. Yes, you're right. This is another bias. I think it's likely that if we see life out there, it will have formed on planets that are relatively similar to the Earth. And the reason I mention that is again to do with water and to do with things that I think are probably a real requirement of life. Once you get to a certain level of technological advancement, and that's beyond what we currently are at, but you can imagine that in a few hundred years or a few thousand years, if we survive, which is another possible solution to the paradox, isn't it? Maybe civilizations don't, but if we survive, then yes, I think the bias against having to look at Earth-like planets going round sun-like stars, that becomes then in play, because would a civilization necessarily want to stay there if it can move? A driver might well be access to energy, ready access to lots of energy, and there are ways of doing that. For instance, creating a Dyson swarm, so they may stay in situ and use something like a Dyson swarm. But I think you're quite right. Maybe they decide to go to these hot, bright, short-lived stars, make use of the copious amounts of energy that are there, and then move on. So given that we don't know anything about what a civilization might do, I think, again, it's important to try and broaden what we search for as much as possible, just on the off chance, if nothing else, that that's what a civilization decides to do. Let's look there. Yeah.
Now, just to shift gears, what initially drew you to compile this list of solutions to the Fermi Paradox? What in your mind said, I'm interested in this, I'm going to go do it? Was there something that precipitated it?
Yes. So I was a science fiction geek as a kid. Asimov, Heinlein, Clarke, the big three. In particular, Asimov, I remember going to a public library and picking a book off the shelf. And I was so young that I mispronounced the name Asminov at the time. And I think it was probably one of Asimov's science books. And as you know, he wrote about everything. He wrote science books for kids, very, very good science books for adults. He wrote about history. He wrote about literature, the Bible, pretty much everything, and science fiction as well. And he was a big influence on, I think, the way I think. He would have celebrated his 100th birthday this month. It's 506 books on the canonical list of Asimov books. I have 503 of them. Incidentally, if any of your listeners have got history of chemistry, a chart, history of mathematics, a chart, history of biology, a chart, those are the three I'm missing, give me a call.
It's just Asimov was so unbelievably prolific in writing that I don't have them all either. So one of these days I'll compile a list of the ones that I don't have.
So yes, he was a huge influence on me, and in many ways I got an education from him. But one of the the activities he was involved in was his magazine, Asimov's science fiction magazine. He lent his name to it and he wrote editorials for it. I get it still. And I first came across the Fermi Paradox in a 1984 issue of that magazine. And Stephen Gillette wrote an essay called The Fermi Paradox. And the next issue, there was a rebuttal by Robert Freitas. And there was quite a heated exchange subsequently in the letters column. And I thought, yeah, what a fascinating question. In part because you can view it from these two angles. On the one hand, yeah, of course, science fiction is telling me that we live in a galaxy that's full of life. It's teeming with life. Some of my favourite television programmes, Star Trek and Doctor Who, were telling me that. My favourite film was Forbidden Planet. It was telling me that. I was living in a science fictional world. People were walking on the moon. Of course we were going to go out into the galaxy and we'd meet other civilizations. But on the other hand, there's this observation, or rather lack of observation. It certainly seems as if the galaxy is cold and dead. And you can almost flip-flop between opposing views, I think, with the Fermi Paradox. On the one hand, part of me wants to believe that we inhabit this exciting galaxy full of life and imagine what we could learn from them. But on the other hand, there are various indications, I think, that maybe it's just us. So I just found this a fascinating question, and I learned almost by accident that people from different fields were bringing different points of view to bear on it. So physicists, of course, we always pile in with our opinion on everything, but astronomers, of course, but biologists, historians, sociologists, everyone was chipping in to this question, and I just got into the habit of collecting them.
Now, one thing you mentioned in the book, and this is something doing what I do, I get asked about constantly, is the UFO phenomena. What is your take on that? I know you have a unique take.
Well, I've seen a UFO. Again, it was one of the most formative experiences, almost, I guess you'd say, that I was out in the street, I was playing football, soccer, as you say in America. That was back when you were able to do that in a street. And I was with a friend. We looked up and we saw a beautiful silver disc hovering over the houses. We stopped and we watched it, and then it just shot away incredibly quickly. And we ran into the house to tell the grown-ups. Looking back, at the time, it was a huge thing. Looking back, as a grown-up myself, I would say, well, there must have been some explanation that my brain was imprinting a meaning on the visual that I was getting and short-circuiting various logical processes and just seeing that light in the sky and saying it's an alien craft. I was living in that science fictional world. It was always on television. The Invaders, for instance, I probably watched that the night before. So I think my youthful brain was imprinting a meaning on photons that were entering my eye. Back when I experienced it, it was incredibly real. Now, I'm sure that when people look up in the sky and see lights, they're seeing things, right?
Oh, I agree. We have to make a distinction here. UFO is unidentified flying object. That places no identification upon it. And, of course, there are many, many things that can happen that might produce a phenomenon that one misinterprets. I have seen out on cruise ships, out in the ocean, fata morganas of lights from cities. And if one didn't know what that was, it might easily be taken as a UFO. As a matter of fact, there's one famous example of a cruise ship bridge, a fata morgana of a cruise ship bridge that some said was an alien spacecraft, which it was not. But one might see something in the atmosphere, especially if you're young, and not really understand what it actually is and misinterpret it. Is that what you feel?
That's exactly what I did. Looking back, I can still clearly visualize what I saw. I can't explain what I saw. Someone recently said perhaps it was an imprint of the football, the soccer ball that I'd been playing with. You sometimes get that after impression of something. Maybe, I don't know. It's just one of these things that you have to say, you don't know. It was unidentified. What in recent years has interested me is the way that there are cameras now around the world. We have cameras in cars, dash cams. We have cameras on bicycle helmets. We have security cameras on buildings and in houses. And they're beginning to catch really what were rare astronomical phenomena, such as meteorites and shooting stars and so on. It used to be very difficult to capture those because they happen so quickly. Now you see them relatively frequently. What none of those cameras have detected so far is a flying saucer, and I find that very telling.
I've also noticed too that there is a geographical aspect to it. The people that see UFOs tend to be they overwhelmingly tend to be Americans and Canadians, but also Europeans in the first world countries essentially. But if you talk to people that aren't familiar with the pop cultural phenomena that surrounds that, they never really see them. And that's another telling thing, I think.
Yes. And another telling thing is that the form of the observations, again, tends to track human technology and what appears in human films and entertainments. So I think it's very telling. Of course, you have these people that say they were abducted, and there's always a lot of probing going on. And clearly, if that were a true event, then yes, if you take them at their word, that resolves the Fermi Paradox, doesn't it? They're here and they're probing people, but there's absolutely no supporting evidence for any of that. So I think we have to rule that out as a solution.
I would expect so, unless in one specific case, the von Neumann probes, if one happened to dip into the atmosphere to do some sampling and someone saw it, well. Yeah.
We always have to, I think, approach these things with an open mind. But as Carl Sagan said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. So certainly things are possible, but I wouldn't accept that as evidence unless there were some supporting evidences to go along with it. Certainly possible, but I find it unconvincing.
I agree. And there's also wishful thinking. I think there are people that wish that were aliens here, but I say be careful what you wish for, because there are some very frightening solutions to the Fermi Paradox. All right, Doctor, thank you for joining us today. It's been a fantastic discussion. And when you release the next edition of the book, I hope you'll come back and visit us.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure.
Randy's Garage. Want to let you in on a little deal. We're having a sale this week on used auto parts from an 85 LeBaron. It's a deal you can't refuse. Now, how can I help you? An engine build, you say? What are you doing, building a rocket? That makes perfect sense. Well, here's what I can do for you. I can do the whole package for $50,000. If you could just text me that delivery address. Wait a second. I know this address. I know who you live with. It's gonna cost you an extra $600. A turkey charge for association with that turkey. Yeah, that's easy for you to say. You're using his credit card. I'll have this out to you around about next Thursday.
You have fallen into Event Horizon with John Michael Godier. In today's episode, John is joined by Dr. Stephen Webb. Dr. Webb is the author of numerous popular science books, including Measuring the Universe, The Cosmological Distance Ladder, as well as If the Universe is Teeming with Aliens, Where is Everybody? 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox and the Problem of Extraterrestrial Life. Dr. Webb earned his PhD in Theoretical Particle Physics at the University of Manchester. His many interests include 50s sci-fi, football, cosmology, and astrobiology. Remember to subscribe to Event Horizon so you never miss an episode.
Stephen Webb, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Now, Stephen, you have a book that has been revised and is one of the most fascinating books I've ever read. If the Universe is Teeming with Aliens, Where is Everybody? 75 Solutions to the Fermi Paradox and the Problem of Extraterrestrial Life. Now, Fermi Paradox solutions are like rabbits. One day you have 75, the next day you have 104. And we just keep thinking of more options as far as what could explain the great silence that we seem to see. Everywhere we look, we don't see any evidence of alien civilizations, but we should, as Fermi pointed out. So the Fermi Paradox is predicated on the idea that maybe when we look into the cosmos, we really should see evidence of alien life. Do you agree with that? I mean, do you fundamentally agree that when we look, we should see?
So, yes, I guess the Fermi Paradox is this contradiction between perhaps naive expectation that there are lots of advanced civilizations out there, the perhaps premature observation that we see no signs of them, at least none that science has commonly accepted. But to put more flesh on that, we know the universe is big, yeah? We know the galaxy is big. It contains lots of stuff, and in particular, it contains many planets. Now, if we assume the Copernican principle, which is a principle that has stood science in good stead for centuries, that there's nothing special about Earth, there's nothing special about us, then presumably life is going to occur on some of those planets. Now, Frank Drake, who sadly passed a few weeks ago, came up with a means of estimating how many civilizations there might be. It's called the Drake equation, but it's not really an equation as such, but it lets you have some ballpark figures to play around with. And people typically think of there being perhaps 10,000 advanced extraterrestrial civilizations, maybe more. On the other hand, the universe is old. Yeah. And one of the fantastic parts of my career has been seeing the precision with which cosmologists now know exactly how old the universe is. When I started, we didn't really know within a factor of 2. Now we know that the universe is 13.8 billion years old, just under. So those extraterrestrial civilizations, which we expect to exist, could have come into existence 10 million years ago, 100 million years ago, maybe billions of years ago, before us. And again, if we allow them the Copernican principle, this idea that there's nothing special about us, well, if they generate technology and it sees that exponential growth that we see in digital, in bioscience, then some of those civilizations should be able to disturb the universe in a way that we would observe. So I do find that mismatch, that contradiction between that expectation, which I share, that there should be civilizations out there, and the observation, I find that very strange. We should live in a noisy neighborhood, but it is eerily quiet. That's the thing.
Eerily quiet. Now, in context, is it based on the Copernican principle? Is it reasonable to assume that we really should see something? In other words, we should see aliens everywhere, which is, I suppose that's what Fermi posited. And should we, is it simply possible? Is it simply possible that our vision isn't good enough and that we actually do see alien civilizations, but we don't recognize them?
It's possible. I think there's a question to be asked about how would we recognize an alien civilization. These would be creatures, if they exist, with whom we share nothing but prebiotic chemistry. So perhaps it is a little bit of a stretch to expect communication to be able to occur. Having said that, there are so many things we can imagine a civilization doing, wanting to do, that even if they don't try and communicate with us, there should be the possibility of seeing technosignatures, for example. We're talking about beings that potentially have had hundreds of millions of years of technological advance. Just to give you an idea of the oceans of time we're talking about, there's more time separating Tyrannosaurus rex from Stegosaurus than separates us from Tyrannosaurus. These are vast stretches of time. And it seems to me that if, and it's a big if technological civilization does get going, then it should be able to disturb the universe in a way that we would see as being clearly artificial and not natural. We might not be able necessarily to communicate with them. We might be looking in entirely the wrong place. There's even a discussion, I guess, to be had about what life itself is. But from everything we know about life as we know it, and I understand that is perhaps entirely anthropomorphic, but how can we talk meaningfully about life as we don't know it? Life as we know it, I think, given those oceans of time, if they exist, if they develop technology, I think there are so many ways in which we would be able to pick up their presence. Of course, we haven't been looking very long. We haven't been looking with or through all of the windows on the universe, perhaps, that we can. And maybe a resolution of the paradox is that we've just got to keep looking. We've got to put more money into this as well. This is, for my mind, one of the most important questions in science, the role that biology plays in the universe, and perhaps the role that intelligence plays in the universe. This is so important that we should be looking with whatever means and whatever tools are at our disposal, because it is so important.
I think I agree entirely with what you said in that it's the most important question in the universe, because somehow, in some way, we represent the universe observing itself. We are what sees the universe. And I think that that's the most fundamental question within science. It often gets downplayed, though. There are a lot of scientists that just don't ask the question. Do you think that there is a bias in science against asking questions about the Fermi Paradox?
I think there has been in the past. I think that the bias is lessening. I think there is increasingly a recognition that this is a question not only that we can ask, but we might be able, with the tools that are coming our way, we might be able to start answering it. I mentioned the age of the universe and how, when I started my career, we didn't know whether the universe was 20 billion years old, 10 billion years old, 7. Now we know, and we know because of fantastic advances in observational science. We have some incredible observatories coming our way in the next few years, and they will be able to ask questions and make observations in ways that were just not thought of 10, 15 years ago. We can start thinking about characterizing exoplanetary atmospheres. It's not that long ago, when I was a student, we didn't know for certain whether other planets existed for sure. So the frustrating thing for me is that I might not be around long enough to see the answer, but I think over the next few decades we do have, as scientists, a really good chance of perhaps answering the question. What would be very, very disturbing is if we keep on observing the universe in more and more detail with more and more exquisite instruments and we still find nothing. That would be a bit spooky, a bit disturbing.
That's something that I think about a lot. The answer to the Fermi Paradox is that we are alone in this gigantic, enormous, possibly even infinite universe. And all of a sudden we sit there and we look and we see nothing for centuries. And that sort of makes the Copernican principle an assumption, doesn't it?
It does. And I find that actually quite disturbing at a psychological level. We're recording this coming up to Halloween, and it's that time of year, spooky films on television. I saw a movie called The Others recently, starring Nicole Kidman. Highly recommend it. And I found it really scary. It's all implied menace, it's implied threat, and there's this isolated house. You don't know what's going on. And for me, it was the not knowing quite what's going on that I find psychologically quite unsettling. And it's entirely possible that we will continue to observe the universe and not find anything, not quite know for certain whether we're alone or not. I think that the answer actually to the Fermi Paradox is that we probably are alone, but it's not a solution, a resolution that I care for emotionally. Of course, the universe doesn't care what I think or what I care, but it is the solution that makes most sense to me. But it would be an eerie feeling, wouldn't it, that in all this immensity, it's us. It's just us rattling around.
Arthur C. Clarke once famously said that either we are alone in the universe or we are not, and both answers are equally disturbing. I actually find the proposition that we're alone particularly disturbing, even more so than discovering alien life, simply because we become an exception to the Copernican principle. All of a sudden, this planet becomes this magical place where organic chemistry of a certain flavor happens, and it happens nowhere else. And that disturbs me. I don't like uniqueness in the universe. I like repeatability. So
can I give you an example of a solution, if you like, to the paradox that came in quite recently? It was published 2020, so it's not in my book.
Absolutely.
And it's just an idea. I mean, it's not necessarily something to be taken for granted, but it gives you an idea of one possible reason why we might be alone, and why maybe the universe has to be as big as it is in order to contain us. So it's a piece of work published by a physicist called Tomonari Tatani. And Tatari says, we don't know how life started, okay? Well, we just don't. We don't know how we got from prebiotic chemistry to life. There's this assumption that the early universe had water, and it had this soup of chemicals, and there were these large gravitational tides and lots of energy going in with lightning and heat and the rest of it. And you cook this broth for tens of millions of years, and somehow you get life. And maybe that's the case. But what are the exact steps involved?
we don't know, but one possibility is something called the RNA world, ribonucleic acid world. And RNA is important because it can store and replicate genetic information like DNA, and that is one of the key definitions of life. And it can catalyze chemical reactions that we know are necessary for life, at least life as we know it. So it can play this double role. So the idea is that somehow you get RNA, and then from RNA, things evolve into more complex things like DNA and so on. Now, RNA is a polymer of nucleotides. Think of it as a chain of these blocks called nucleotides. And you need about 40, maybe 100 of these nucleotides in a chain in a particular order in order to have self-replication. Now, there might be some mechanism that polymerizes nucleotides to create this RNA, but we don't know what that mechanism would be. And as far as we know, it's just a stochastic random process, right? You're just adding, or nature is adding one nucleotide to another and seeing if they fit in just some random process. Now, if it is random, this turns out to be a combinatoric problem, and the chances of RNA just coming into being are astronomical. And actually, it's a lot worse than astronomical. Essentially, there's no chance of it happening in our observable universe of, 10 to the 22 stars. But Tatari says our best model of the cosmos suggests it came into being from an inflationary period. So you have this small patch of space-time, and that expands exponentially. You get exponential inflation. So our observable universe is just a small patch of a much bigger multiverse of very, very many other patches, perhaps similar to our own. We don't know for certain because it's beyond the horizon, but perhaps like ours. And Tatari said that in that multiverse of perhaps 10 to the 100 sun-like stars, you could, just from a random chance, get this abiogenesis. Now, not to take that too seriously, but it gives you an idea of how it could be just a chance event, but it's a chance event that leaves us unique, not only in this case in our observable universe, but in the multiverse. That is, to my mind, super spooky.
Would you characterize, having written a book on the solutions to the Fermi Paradox, would you characterize the option that we are alone as the most terrifying?
Not necessarily. I think it's the most psychologically problematic solution, at least for me. But then if we go to this analogy of Halloween movies, on the one hand, you have something like The Others, which is quite subtle. At the other end, you have these mad axe murderer movies where some madman's going around chopping up teenagers. It doesn't appeal to me. But there are solutions where you assume that there are predators out there. And if you believe in the existence of extraterrestrial civilizations, then one possibility is that either there's predation going on, or civilizations keep quiet, we don't see them, because they fear that there might be predation going on. So that could be quite an unpleasant solution.
One of my favorite film franchises of all time, speaking of scary Halloween movies, is Alien. And is it possible that we simply assume too much about alien civilizations, and that maybe they are so different from us that we don't really know what to look for, because you can't exactly see a xenomorph, attacking people on a starship from a distance. You can't really see that. So is it possible that we are just a very broad species in our abilities, and we emit a technosignature, as weak as it is? We emit radio and things that can be seen ostensibly at a distance. But could it just simply be that most intelligent life in the universe is in the form of things like the alien?
Absolutely. And we always have to be on our guard against this anthropomorphizing in general. So I mentioned the predator interpretation. I mean, it goes back to Fred Saberhagen with Berserkers, and more recently, The Dark Forest of Cixin Liu. But they're predicated on this idea that alien civilizations would have the same motivations as us, that they'd take this first strike approach because they assume everyone else will take that first strike approach, seek out new life, new civilizations and kill it. That might be a very, very parochial attitude. And it's very difficult, I think, to free our minds of the attitudes that have developed within us. I mean, we are creatures that have evolved on a certain planet with a certain environment, and it's given us certain predispositions which we have to have in order to survive and pass on our DNA. Out there, those civilizations, as I say, with whom we would share nothing but prebiotic chemistry, who knows what evolutionary pathways would have taken them down. So I think you're right that we can't or shouldn't assume things about extraterrestrial civilizations, except that I think they have to obey the laws of physics as we currently understand them. They may have a much more evolved understanding of physics, but I think it's important when we're discussing these things to stick to what we know. Otherwise, it's a little bit like playing tennis with the net down. There's no rules. You can imagine anything. So I think we have to restrict ourselves to assuming that alien beings, if they exist, obey the laws of physics as we understand them. Probably they have to obey laws of economics. But other than that, I think you're right. We have to try and be as non-parochial as we can possibly be. And it's difficult.
Is that a solution to the Fermi Paradox, though, that alien civilizations are simply not as broad as we are, and that they just never get to the level of detectability simply because they're not equipped to? So they may be bound in oceans as aquatic life, or something stops them from getting to our level, and that it's simply that the solution is that we got lucky being bipedal mammals.
Well, of course. I mean, if you think of what it is that we're talking about in terms of making our presence felt across the universe, disturbing the universe in a way that another being can detect. So we're talking about, first of all, being terrestrial creatures, because you're quite right. You can imagine aquatic creatures, super intelligent. They're not going to make their presence known. Dolphins, I don't know how intelligent they are. Octopuses seem to be very intelligent. However intelligent they are not going to make their presence felt across the universe. So it's a terrestrial civilization. You need that civilization to take, or you need that intelligence to happen on a planet where there is raw materials for the development of technology. Okay, if you don't have access to energy dense material, it's difficult to see what it is that you can do in terms of developing a civilization. The act of reaching out across interstellar space presumably is not an act that can happen with an individual member, an individual creature. We're talking about social creatures, presumably, because this would have to be an act of a group, a civilization reaching out across space. So that implies social groupings. It implies communication skills, sophisticated grammar in order to agree among the groupings that this is something that we're going to devote time and effort and resource towards doing. And it requires that level of intelligence. I mean, why? We think we are atop some level of evolutionary ladder. We're really not. I mean, we're just one tiny twig on this branch of evolution. But we do have a highly developed level of intelligence. Why do we have that? I mean, what evolutionary benefit does the ability to do integral calculus afford us? Now it gives us access to technology, but how did that evolve? Is it just some sort of accidental byproduct? So I would argue that we are actually incredibly special, but so is every other creature that has evolved on this planet for the past billion years. It's just that our particular constellation of qualities, that idea of social grouping and complex grammar and high level of intelligence, that set of qualities that define us, they happen to be the set of qualities that enable us, perhaps, if we survive, to make our presence felt across the universe. And it's those sorts of qualities that presumably some alien creatures would have to have if they were going to reach out across the universe. Of course, a depressing thought is that maybe all of this constellation of qualities, intelligence plus opposable thumbs, maybe that's a bad long-term evolutionary strategy. Maybe intelligence plus opposable thumbs equals disaster. I mean, that's another depressing resolution of the Fermi Paradox.
Yes, and that civilizations, once they arise, they quickly burn out, and we sort of look like that a little bit at this point. Now, could it be, as far as odds of celestial bodies producing alien life, could it be, based on our solar system, where we have a whole bunch of candidates for ice shell moons, oceans underneath ice, could it be that the universe is largely aquatic and that the best we can ever hope for as far as an alien contact signal to us is a plea for help and an ask for uplifting because they're stuck in an ocean and we aren't? Does that have legs?
I don't think they would be able to make that connection. I don't think they would know of the external world necessarily. It would be fascinating if we could communicate with an octopus or a dolphin and try and understand what it is that they perceive of the world and what they understand of the world. But I suspect that they would have zero understanding of the cosmos and zero ability to make their presence felt. What you mentioned about ice worlds and oceans in the solar system in particular, I think that's fascinating. On a very short time scale, we might be able to find out whether abiogenesis is actually not as rare as I suggested it might have been. Maybe we get to Mars and we analyze samples and we discover that Mars was once home to life that arose independently of life on Earth. Or we go to Enceladus or some of the other moons and discover that life began there. That would be an absolutely amazing discovery if we find that. It then suggests that abiogenesis isn't that incredibly rare thing that Tatari said it might be, but it's actually very common. If we find that, though, if we do discover that, it really suggests that the answer to the Fermi Paradox is not necessarily something that's beneficial for us. It perhaps means that the reason we don't see advanced civilizations, even though there really should be because there's all this life out there, it's because for whatever reason, either a hostile universe or the fact that intelligent species inevitably bring about their own destruction. I think it brings that much more to the fore as a potential solution. So part of me hopes that we don't find life on Mars or Enceladus or these other worlds.
That gets into questions of panspermia and our own origins. We could actually be aliens to this world if life arose on Mars and was deposited here very early after the late heavy bombardment or during it. But my question to you is this. Okay, so we have all these missions and we're thinking of even more in the future to go and investigate the possibility of abiogenesis in ice shell moons and on Mars and Venus for that matter. If we find that and we actually find a second genesis of life within our own solar system, does that for you solve the Fermi Paradox? And you can safely say they must be everywhere in various forms, maybe not as complex as we are, but maybe we're rare, but life itself is not. Does that solve the Fermi Paradox for you?
No, it actually makes it a lot stronger. What that discovery, I think, if it happens, what that discovery would allow us to conclude is that life itself, the creation of life itself, is a common occurrence, because we would have multiple examples in one solar system. We can, I think, safely assume that other solar systems, other exoplanetary systems, would then, adopting that Copernican principle, would then have lots of at least low-grade life. It would begin to address the question about the role that biology plays in the universe, and it would enable us perhaps then to go out and start thinking about the characterization of exoplanetary atmospheres and look for the presence perhaps of low-grade life affecting exoplanetary atmospheres. But if the universe really is teeming with low-grade life, why then, seemingly, has that evolutionary process towards extraterrestrial civilizations not seemingly taken place? So I think it would actually strengthen the paradox. And I've changed my thinking considerably over the past few years around this. I used to think that maybe the universe was full of, some sort of pond scum and low-grade life. And I still think it's possible, but the only way out of the Fermi paradox that I can see in that case, other than that there's a barrier ahead of us that somehow intelligence dies out, is that the jump from, if you like, single-celled creatures to multicellular organisms, perhaps that's the jump that's difficult. And I think that's what we would have to hope is the case, that getting from simple unicellular life to complex multicellular life, maybe that's the difficult jump, and maybe that's what makes us special here on Earth.
That took Earth like something on the order of 1.8 billion years to do that, right? So that's a strong, great filter.
Presumably. And it's difficult to know what happened, given that it happened a long time ago, but presumably one cell ingested another for food, and for whatever reason, those two cells coexisted, or maybe one cell infected another, and rather than the infection killing the first cell again, some sort of symbiotic relationship took place. It's difficult to know what happened, but maybe that is something that is unlikely to happen. And certainly on Earth, that long stretch of time that you mentioned perhaps indicates that it is a barrier to jump. Yeah.
That is actually a really fascinating thought, that the development of symbiosis between organisms, which we see on this planet. There are examples, for example, beans, where they carry a beneficial nitrogen-fixing bacteria with them in their seeds and infect the soil with it so that they can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. And that's an interesting idea because it simply says that the solution of the Fermi paradox is that everything is microbial until it chemically reaches a point where it can actually exist symbiotically with another organism. But that also seems to open up a rather scary door, because when you have symbiosis like that, doesn't that increase the chances, increase the complexity and the possibility of extinction?
It absolutely does. And it's another example where really to understand ourselves and our history, I think astrobiology can play potentially a really important role. And I don't think we're going to find the answers to these questions in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But I really am hopeful that with things like the Extremely Large Telescope coming, possibly even Webb, certainly with the successors to Webb, that we might be able to start reaching out, studying exoplanets, and maybe getting a handle on these sorts of questions. I realise that so far I've been saying that, well, my preferred solution is that we're alone, and we've looked at solutions that suggest that we might be alone, or at least that we're the only intelligent species. I have to say, a lot of people would argue that actually there is no Fermi paradox because they are here. You mentioned panspermia. One possibility is directed panspermia, so that the origin of life here on Earth came about because we were deliberately seeded by some other alien beings. And that idea that aliens are here or were here, I mean, that stretches right the way through to UAP, the modern UAP phenomena, zoo hypothesis, planetarium hypothesis. So just for the sake of completeness, I have to say that actually possibly the most popular resolution of the Fermi paradox is that actually there isn't one, they're here.
Now, we, of course, live in a world where a great many people believe they're here and people see things. And I, for one, don't doubt that people see things that they can't explain. I absolutely believe that people see UFOs. The question is, what is their origin and what are they? Do you think, based on the evidence that we have, and we have these things like congressional hearings in the U.S. here and things like that that are looking into the long history of ufology, do you think that that has legs? As a scientist, can you look at what we know based on that and say, this is worth looking into? Or, no, nothing here?
So I would say, no, there's nothing there. If you are arguing that these are alien craft, okay, there's clearly something there. But I think it's important not to prejudge any of this. And this is where I have some issues with what's happening at present. So clearly there are UFOs, clearly there are, to use the more modern terminology, UAPs, unidentified aerial phenomena. That's just, it's a given, it's clear. There are records of them. What are they? Well, if we're going to investigate that question scientifically, that's fine. And I'd argue actually that we have to for safety reasons, because if these things are happening around military jets, there's the possibility of dreadful things happening. If it's happening around just commercial air flights, accidents might happen. So absolutely they need to be investigated. But why on earth would you go to astronomers as the first point of call for investigating these? It's almost as if you're saying that I know what these UAPs are. I've identified them. They're craft. They're alien craft. No, we don't know that. I think the people that need to be involved first in this identification and this research about trying to identify them software engineers, optical physicists, psychologists, aeronautical engineers. There's a dozen specialities that I think should be brought to bear before you even think about bringing astronomers into the discussion, because frankly the skill set of astronomers is not something that's particularly going to help, I wouldn't have thought, with this particular problem.
Well, that's always been the question, because everybody always looks to the astronomers because public perception, they're the ones that look at the skies. But the thing is that they typically only look at a very tiny part of the sky and would miss the UFO if it flew by. And it's just not their bag. But what I wonder is if the best specialized scientists would be the atmospheric scientists, because
absolutely,
there's some weird stuff that happens in the atmosphere of this planet as far as plasmas and things like that go, that an astronomer wouldn't really, that's not what they do. So we should be asking the atmospheric scientists, right?
Absolutely. That would be, personally, my first port of call. If I can just, you just popped something into my head, which illustrates, I think, something potentially about the Fermi Paradox, but also about the skill sets of different scientists. There was a gamma ray burst detected a few weeks ago. I can even remember what the name of it is, because I know the dates when it was found. It's GRB 221009A. And this is the brightest gamma ray burst ever detected. Now, this is a Fermi Paradox solution, because if you're anywhere near a gamma ray burst, you're toast. What's fascinating about this one is that it's about 2 billion light years away. I mean, quite a distance. And yet atmospheric scientists, and this is what you said that just popped into my mind, atmospheric scientists detected it. It affected the way that radio waves propagated in Earth's atmosphere from a distance of 2 billion light years. I find it absolutely incredible that the universe can impact on Earth from that distance, but it can. And it was atmospheric scientists that noticed that impact. I don't think astronomers particularly would have thought about that. They were interested in, it was Fermi Space Satellite that detected it, and various other gamma ray and X-ray telescopes. Incredibly bright event, incredibly violent event, and actually a nice example of astronomers and atmospheric scientists working in tandem, but they were looking at very different things.
But it's still the universe. So anything that you observe is an aspect of the universe, so they kind of mesh together. Do you think that interdisciplinary science is a disadvantage? In other words, do you think people are too specialized and don't come together enough for a complete understanding of the universe? Do you think that crossing the aisle between sciences, we need more of that?
Oh, absolutely. And this is one of the fascinating aspects of this question for me, the Fermi question. I find it fascinating because physicists have a take on it. Well, of course we do, because we're arrogant and we have a take on everything. But astronomers have something to say about it. Biologists have something to say about it. I've seen lots of interesting papers from historians and sociologists. This is a question that can bring so many people together with so many different insights, and we can learn from each other, and that's one of the beauties, I think, of an interdisciplinary question like this. The problem we have is institutionally, it can be difficult to bring these people together. There are relatively few mechanisms for doing that. And it is still the case that in terms of academic career advancement, you're better off picking a sub-sliver of nothing and becoming the world's expert in that than you are taking a broader view. I think that's a shame.
It is a shame. I mean, it's almost a compartmentalization of the understanding of the universe. And that, I mean, we even need perhaps to talk to archaeologists, and the idea of maybe if we
Absolutely.
start looking in the solar system at interstellar objects passing through, maybe astroarchaeology might become a science, or something like astropaleontology, things that we just don't really think of right now because of a lack of open mind, perhaps, in that in anything we do when looking into the cosmos, we might simply be thwarted by our own biases and we're missing it. Do you think that we're simply missing it? Is that the solution to the Fermi Paradox?
We have to be so aware of bias. And let me give you one example of a bias that I think can negatively impact on our thinking in this area. And I'd call it a recency bias, or a modernity bias. I'm not sure what the word would be, but if you look through history, the solutions that people come up with to the problem of extraterrestrial life are cast in terms of the technology that's available to them right then and there, almost inevitably, perhaps. So we have, really great thinkers like Gauss. I mean, one of the great mathematical minds of all time. He was thinking about the possibility of communicating across interplanetary distances by digging trenches in the desert, pouring kerosene in and setting fire to it in the shape, a trench of the shape of an equilateral triangle, or something like that, or planting forests in the shape of an equilateral triangle, something that could be visible from Mars. Great thinker like that, inevitably constrained by the technology that was available to him of the day. A little bit later, Victorian times, the Victorians have this great public health initiative of canalisation. You get dirty water away, you get clean water to a city. It vastly improved public health and led to increased lifespan. It's a great invention. Soon after that, people started seeing canals on Mars. Canals, incidentally, that aren't there. We, in the 1950s, started thinking about, well, how can we send signals across interstellar space? And Cocconi and Morrison were looking at electromagnetism, and we were understanding radio at that time. We had radio sets, and they came up with radio as the means of doing it. Around about the same time, lasers were invented, but they were puny things back then. Now we understand how much power you can pump into a laser, and now we're thinking, well, optical SETI's possibly a good bet. We can outshine a star at certain wavelengths by pumping in energy at particular wavelengths into a laser. So if you look back at the thinking around this, it's always constrained by the technology that's available to us at a particular time. And almost, how could it be any different? That's what shapes our thinking. I don't know how we move away from those shackles. Maybe science fiction can help us. Maybe there are other creative ways of doing it. But that's an example of just one bias, I think, that's a cognitive bias that's very, very difficult for us to move away from. But when we're talking about creatures, and I go back to this, with whom we share nothing in common apart from chemistry and a shared physical universe, we have to be open, I think, to many different possibilities. And it's difficult. It's difficult to take that interdisciplinary approach. It's difficult to take that approach where we free ourselves of all of these mental biases. So maybe the solution is we're just not clever enough yet to understand the solution to the Fermi Paradox.
I have to toss something out there that amuses me. The idea that if we ever came into contact with an alien civilization And they tell us that the reason they haven't communicated with us is that they were expecting us to plant a bunch of trees in a triangle, and that would have been it. All right, Doctor, we have to take a break, and we will be back in a moment. Now, Doctor, as someone that has studied the Fermi Paradox extensively, out of all of the solutions to the Fermi Paradox, which one keeps you up at night? Which one disturbs you the most?
It's the thought that we are alone, and I can tell you why. It's when you go out on a cloudless night and you look up at the sky, and depending on where you are and how much light pollution there is, you can see a few tens of stars, if you're lucky, thousands of stars. I've seen the Milky Way, and it's a gorgeous sight. The universe is vast, and I do find it psychologically unsettling to think that it's just us, that we are the only intelligent, sapient species in the universe. That's the solution that I think is correct. I think it's the solution that certainly addresses observation, or the lack of observation of extraterrestrials. But it is one that I find profoundly disturbing, profoundly disappointing as well, because I was brought up in a science fictional universe, and I would love us to be able to communicate with other beings, find out what their thoughts are about religion, about science, about music. All of these things, these questions that it would be fascinating to ask them, might just be impossible because it's just us. The other weighty aspect to that solution is that it puts, I think, a huge pressure on humankind not to screw things up. And I'm talking from an island that has recently had a competition between the Prime Minister and a lettuce, a salad, and the salad won. So I'm very... Occasionally, when things like that happen, I'm very depressed about the thought of whether we will actually survive, and whether potentially the only part of the universe that can observe itself, which is here, it might die out, and that would be an absolute cosmic tragedy. So that keeps me up at times.
Now, could you say, and this has been advanced in theoretical physics before, collapsing wave functions, if we weren't here, would the universe ultimately even exist? And if it did, what would it matter?
That is an absolutely fascinating question. I have to say that, yes, I think it would exist. But would it matter? No, I think these are fascinating philosophical questions, John. And you really need to get a philosopher on to answer those things. A physicist, a scientist, is probably lacking the mental acuity, I think, to answer those sorts of questions. A philosopher, I know that physicists often decry the input of philosophers, but these are the sorts of questions where actually philosophical thought comes into its own. And I have had discussions with philosophers in Italy about the ethical and the moral dimension to the Fermi Paradox. If it really is just us, what are the ethical and the moral dimensions? But that question that you asked, what would it matter if we weren't here and the universe were empty? Ask a philosopher. I would be fascinated to know what they think of that.
I will do so at some point. I think my biggest question there is that if we are alone and we never see anything, which, I mean, that's something we could never prove.
No.
We could never prove we are alone. But
No,
one could say that if we think we are alone, philosophy becomes that much more important because all of a sudden the Copernican principle is defeated and we apparently occupy the most important point in the universe.
Well, shouldn't we act as if we were alone until we know we're not? I'm asking that. I'm just putting the question back to you. Should we not?
Well, I like the Copernican principle, and here's my biases. I like repeatability. I like that the universe always produces other examples, and that things are simply a member of a population of like objects, like occurrences. My natural inclination is to say that we're not alone, and that we're just one civilization out of many that exist through time and space, and that ultimately, if things like the geometry of the universe and, it appears to be flat, so maybe it's infinite, in which case we can't be alone because you're up against infinity. There has to be other examples. So I tend to live in that zone where I just assume that we're not special and that we're just one occurrence of many. Now, we might be rare. We might be very rare, and intelligence doesn't happen that often. But I agree with you in the sense that us being alone is the most disturbing solution to the Fermi Paradox, because we suddenly look very unlikely and very unnatural. And that does bother me. Now, there are contenders. The zoo hypothesis is a pretty spooky one.
Yes.
Or a group of spooky solutions. But that we are alone does, at its very deepest, terrify me.
The zoo hypothesis and the planetarium hypothesis, I find spooky, absolutely. That notion that the universe is infinite and therefore there must be other life out there, I take issue with it slightly, in that the observable universe, which is what we're talking about, that has a definite horizon. Beyond that, absolutely, who knows? But I would say until we have the evidence to the contrary, I think it is safer to assume that we are alone. Because one of the worries that I would have is that if we assume that we're not, there's the possibility that at least some people will think that salvation is going to come from outside of us, that things won't screw up because these benevolent beings will save us, that they're out there, they wouldn't let bad things happen to us. I think that's a dangerous assumption. I think it's a safer assumption to say, as far as we know, we're alone, and that whether we survive or not is down to our actions, and there's an imperative on us to get our act together. And if we want to disturb the universe in a way that we hope other civilizations might, and we might one day pick up, if we want to be in that position, we have to survive long enough in order to do that, and that's going to take work, and it's hard work that we have to engage in. We can't outsource that hard work to some potentially mythical alien beings.
Could it be a unifying factor, though? Say that we discovered a radio signal, something like that, the wow signal repeats, or something that's unambiguous, which is really, really hard in SETI, but an unambiguous signature of an alien civilization out there somewhere. Could that galvanize the human species to say, look, they survived and have built a high technology civilization, so can we. So maybe we need to look at our problems a little bit more carefully and work towards solving them and think a little bit further than a year ahead, and we can achieve that. Do you think that the discovery of alien life, through whatever means, might be a unifying, galvanizing factor for humanity and a watershed to get us to act responsibly for a change?
I guess it would depend on the nature of the signal. If it's a signal similar to what Arthur Clarke described in The Star, which was the dying, we are here beacon of a civilization whose star is going to destroy them in a supernova, that would be unbearably poignant. That would be one sort of communication. I like to think that what you just described would happen, that it would be a watershed moment in history. The cynic in me, and I am sounding awfully cynical, but it's partly to do with the news cycle in this country in particular over the past few weeks. The cynic in me would say, I wonder whether it would be a 7-day wonder that would almost immediately be forgotten. And the reason I say that is that the distances involved, assuming that we're living in a universe that has that speed of light speed limit, we won't even be able to share a knock-knock joke with that civilization. But we would at least, you're quite right, have the knowledge then that we were not alone. I suspect that the impact would be that of a 7-day wonder, and then it would die away. But I think it would have a profound long-term effect on humans. I think it would have an impact on philosophy. It would have an impact on religion. It would have an impact on ultimately how we view ourselves. But it would, I think, take a long time for that to percolate through our society. It's a fascinating question, and it's a great what if.
Well, you have to digest what you learn, and that doesn't happen overnight. And I wonder, to end on this, I wonder about certain things. That there was once an atmospheric scientist that looked into the UAP phenomena, Dr. James E. McDonald. And his conclusions after many years of studying it was that the alien hypothesis was the least worst one. Do you think that there could be things in the universe that are even stranger than alien life?
If we found alien life, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me. Okay, I've spent a lot of this interview saying that I think we're alone, and I think we are. But if we found evidence of alien life, it wouldn't necessarily surprise me because of the first leg of the Fermi Paradox, which is this idea that actually, if there's nothing special about us and we're talking about normal physical, chemical, biological processes, you would expect to see them. So in that sense, I don't think the discovery of life would be strange. It would be phenomenal, but not necessarily strange. I think the manifestation of that life would seem strange to us because of who knows what evolutionary pathways would have, where it would have taken them. So it would appear strange, but the discovery itself isn't strange. Is there anything stranger than alien life? I am very much a materialist. I don't share some of the views that perhaps fringe communities do. But I find, actually, within physics, a huge amount of strangeness. You mentioned quantum physics. That's strange. It's something I've spent my career in part studying. I understand the mathematics of it, but when I try and get my head around actually what it means, do we have the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is one that increasingly I'm coming around to accepting, but that's strange. So I think even within the physical universe, there's plenty enough strangeness to go around.
That's a disturbing thought. If the many worlds interpretation is correct, we may be in the one timeline that doesn't have alien life and that all the others do. Now, Doctor,
that's
that would be the ultimate and disappointing for me, is that I'm in the reality that doesn't have it.
damn.
Now, tell us about your books. What are you working on?
So I have a book out in December. It's called Around the World in 80 Ways. So it's a collection of 80 choropleths, which are coloured world maps. And I've used world maps to illustrate various data sets, things of interest, questions of interest to me, like life expectancy in different countries, the proportion of energy that comes from renewables in different countries and nuclear power in different countries, and so on. So that was a bit of a lockdown project for me. I've just finished the first draft of a book whose title I'm not quite sure about, but it'll be something like a pub quiz guide to the universe. So I have 500 strange questions that I find quite interesting, and the idea is that the solutions to those questions, which I will provide, give a history of astronomy and our understanding of the universe. So that's what I've been working on recently.
Now, that sounds absolutely interesting. Everybody can check out Dr. Webb's books at your favorite online book retailer or otherwise. And Doctor, thanks for joining us again today. And I look forward to perhaps another discussion someday about the many and growing solutions to the Fermi Paradox.
I hope so, John. It's been fascinating, as always, with you.
Event Horizon and my channel are now available as a podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube memberships. Early ad-free episodes, bonus episodes, and sleep-focused content. Sign up now by clicking the links below to your platform of choice. Anna, it's Halloween. Where's my pirate hat?
John, isn't it time for a new hat? You've gone as a pirate every Halloween since 1977. And the hat is getting a bit faded.
No, that's unthinkable. I've been through everything with that hat. I started my YouTube channel wearing it. Now where is it?
Look in the corner, John.
Wait a minute. The possum is wearing my hat. And he's resized it. It won't fit now.
He simply washed it, John. Something you never did. I'm afraid to say it did shrink a little. But he's done a trade. Look in the driveway.
There's a car out there. Is the LeBaron back? No, it's even better. An El Camino. I can drive in style again. Wait a minute. Doesn't have an engine. Hold on. Why is there a horse grazing in the backyard? Wait a minute. The possum expects me to drive the car being pulled by a horse.
You always said you wanted more horsepower, John.
I just want my hat back. And the possum cackles. Anyway, happy Halloween, everyone. We often see ourselves anthropocentrically, meaning that we have a bias based on ourselves and what we do as a civilization. In other words, there is us, and there are hypothetical exocivilizations that could be out there in the Milky Way. For lack of a better word, this hubris is not really on solid ground. In fact, if there are exocivilizations out there in the Milky Way, then we would be every bit as much of an alien civilization to them as they would be to us. In short, we are someone else's aliens, so here are 10 reasons why we are just as much of an exocivilization as anyone else that might be out there. Number 10. Earth is an exoplanet. Essentially, there are two ways humans can view planet Earth, or indeed our entire solar system. One is how we generally do it. We see Earth as a planet, and we see the other planets of the solar system as, well, planets. But this is anthropocentric because in reality our solar system is just one member of billions of other star systems within the Milky Way galaxy. Other than perhaps supporting a civilization, the Sun is really just another star, and while it may not be pedestrian, there also aren't too many aspects of the solar system that seem unique in comparison to other systems. But anyone else in the universe would see things a bit differently. From their perspective, Earth would be an exoplanet, and it is. There are very likely other Earths, analogs of this world, that might look much like it in many ways. Astronomers search for such planets specifically because they are Earth-like, so possibly someone out there on a planet similar to this one is studying an odd exoplanet orbiting around a Type G star with unusual levels of oxygen in its atmosphere, specifically because it resembles their own world. They might not know it, but they would be looking at us. Number 9. We prove the plausibility of exocivilizations simply by existing. Often, when discussing the Fermi Paradox, the existence of alien life, and the possibility of exocivilizations, what gets lost in translation is the fact that we already know of a full-blown technologically advanced species, ourselves, and to anyone else present in the Milky Way, we are a full-blown alien civilization. Regardless of the solution to the Fermi Paradox, our own existence proves that alien civilizations are possible. They may be exceedingly rare, or alternatively very common, but the bottom line is that they are plausible, or we wouldn't be here. Number 8. Anyone in the galaxy could know Earth has a biosphere. As a civilization right now, humanity is not easily visible to other exocivilizations. We've only been visible through our technology for less than a century, meaning that only civilizations that might be very close, within 100 light years, have any hope of picking us up. And even then, in order to do it, they'd have to be looking directly at us. But, had they been looking longer, say in searches for transiting exoplanets, they would have to know that something wasn't quite normal with our planet, regardless of whether there's intelligence here. That's life on Earth itself. This planet would appear highly unusual to an exocivilization due to the gases in our atmosphere, specifically the oxygen and methane. While these are not dead ringers for the presence of a biosphere, they are pretty strong indicators. That would allow other exocivilizations to do further experiments, such as looking for the infrared reflectivity of photosynthesizing plants on the surface of the Earth. If they saw that, they would know that the surface of this world has life, and this has been visible for a very, very long time. Well enough for any exocivilization in the Milky Way capable of studying Earth from afar to have seen evidence of life on this world. And even those that couldn't study Earth directly might know through contact between other exocivilizations that might be out there. Conceptual speculations such as an internet-like communications network across the galaxy have been advanced where knowledge can be passed between civilizations. Who knows what's been whispered about Earth? Number 7. We've deliberately sent out signs we are intelligent. If Earth's life itself, broadcasting its existence through the presence of an oxygenated atmosphere, isn't enough, we've also on several occasions made ourselves visible to future advanced exocivilizations that happen to be looking through SETI experiments of their own. First and foremost are the radio signals we've sent out, such as the Arecibo signal, where a civilization that might be looking for radio signals from other worlds might pick up our signal. Or, alternatively, they may pick up some of the more powerful radar we use. The unfortunate, or perhaps fortunate reality of this, however, is that we didn't repeat the Arecibo signal, nor do we tend to repeat any transmissions we send out as part of METI. In other words, we would probably be someone else's WOW signal, and they would be forever wondering what that unconfirmed signal they received really was. But that's not the only way someone might find evidence of us. In the distant far future, someone may come across our probes that we've sent out. We've mounted plaques, and even gold records on them, that contain information about us. While finding one of these dead probes wandering the Milky Way is beyond a needle in a haystack proposition, and it seems more likely that we will in the future go out and retrieve those probes and put them in museums, it's at least marginally possible that someone might find them thousands of years from now and wonder what we were like, or if we're still around, initiate contact with us. But there's one final possibility. Say in the far future, perhaps after we're long gone, someone might come and investigate this strange star system with the apparently habitable water world with oxygen in its atmosphere. If so, they may find all manner of evidence of us, from our defunct solar system probes to evidence of past civilization on Earth itself, and maybe they might even find whatever remains of Elon Musk's Tesla. Number 6. We are already building a Dyson swarm. When we speculate about far future technologies, things like Dyson spheres, Niven rings, and the like, it still seems like science fiction. And it is. We have yet to build anything like those concepts. Except one. We have already begun building a rudimentary Dyson swarm. Despite the name, Freeman Dyson's original idea wasn't to encase a star in a solid shell. That concept actually goes back to sci-fi author Olaf Stapledon writing in the 1930s. Instead, Dyson suggested a network of energy collectors, satellites of the sun, that serve to power an advancing civilization. And while in that capacity we have yet to do that, we have indeed constructed a rudimentary, very infantile Dyson swarm through our launching of solar-powered probes, many of which are now dead, but still out there. Much work needs to be done on our baby Dyson swarm, but we continue to launch probes, and there seems to be nothing stopping us from eventually directly harvesting the energy of the sun in space for use down here. How viable that will be, though, remains to be seen. Number 5. We are actively exploring other worlds. Perhaps one of the hallmarks of advancing civilization anywhere in the universe is that they at least attempt to explore their immediate environs. For a civilization to advance the technology, it seems part and parcel that they would explore their own world. That drive to explore should continue, as it has for us, into space, at least for a time. It could also be the case that exploration eventually becomes meaningless for a society. Going to other star systems to explore could prove to be an unjustifiably expensive venture, ultimately leading to stay-at-home aliens. But with our own civilization, we are at the beginning of our period of exploration, extending our reach with probes visiting many of the worlds in our own solar system, and the direct exploration of the surface of planets like Mars, and even Venus, and human trips to the moon with Apollo. With recent developments in the human exploration of the solar system, it seems we are now poised to put humans on Mars, either for short-term exploration or even long-term colonization. We, as a civilization, are actively exploring other worlds. Number 4. We've extended Earth's biosphere. The case could be made that along with humanity, necessarily comes our environment here on Earth. After all, we can't survive without the oxygen, symbiotic microorganisms, liquid water, and everything else that we need that we have here. To go to space, all of those things must come with us. So, as astrophysicist Adam Frank has pointed out, colonization of the solar system and beyond isn't just the human species colonizing, but Earth's biosphere itself colonizing. We've done this already. Earth's biosphere is literally in orbit in the form of the sealed environment of the International Space Station, and indeed past space stations where bubbles of Earth's environment kept humans alive. And there are our spacecraft and spacesuits, which must also provide an Earth-like environment for their occupants to live in. This will continue to be the case for any colony we might found on the Moon or Mars. And Earth may not have needed us to accomplish this colonization in the past. While humans may not be so resilient, there are really only a few ways you can alter the air we can breathe in space, and you definitely can't get past our need for water. There are creatures on this Earth that can deal with much harsher conditions off-world, even to the point of being able to survive by completely drying out, or even survive doses of radiation above what they might get under normal conditions in space. This opens up the possibility of life from Earth colonizing other worlds on its own, no humans needed, through transportation on meteorites blasted off Earth's surface. Known as panspermia, we have no idea if this has, in fact, ever successfully happened, but given the resiliency of organisms like tardigrades or various microbes to the conditions of space, one wonders where Earth's life has been. But for humans, there does seem to be a point where this status quo might end. Should we ever decide to become a machine civilization rather than a biological one, then entirely new environments open up. In fact, the cold of deep space itself, totally devoid of corrosive atmospheres, might prove ideal for a future humanity, whereas that environment had once been among the harshest thinkable for a biological human. Number 3. We have big plans to colonize the solar system. It may not seem like we're poised to explore and colonize our solar system. Indeed, We showed little interest in actually doing that from the end of Apollo until recently. There were aborted plans, of course, ideas for lunar and Martian colonies, but none came to fruition or even serious development. Part of the reason for that is, of course, what do you do with such a colony once you found it? Part of the problem in answering that question was just how expensive it was to get people and materials for such an endeavor into space. It was prohibitive, and few activities beyond low Earth orbit seemed to promise any kind of return, other than the human exploration of the solar system. But this is changing. Due to a large drop in launch costs, due largely to companies like SpaceX, this equation seems to be changing. It may soon be profitable, for example, to mine asteroids for precious metals and return them to Earth. Indeed, even colonies on the Moon or Mars could prove to be viable through the creation of extensions of our global economy to those worlds. If there's incentive, there's a way. But what would an alien civilization looking at us see? Not much, to be honest. They might pick up laser communications between the colonies and Earth if they were lined up right, or they may pick up evidence of asteroid mining. But eventually, what they would undoubtedly see are dramatic long-term changes in the climates of certain planets in our solar system, such as Mars and Venus. They would see a habitable world initially, and then, perhaps over time, 2 habitable worlds as we begin to terraform. Then they might see a 3rd habitable world, where there was once only a very inhospitable planet like Venus. They might detect chemicals that do not occur in nature, such as CFCs, that make excellent tools for terraforming. In short, once we begin the process of terraforming worlds other than Earth, which it could be argued that we've already begun to do so inadvertently, then we will tell any civilizations in the galaxy capable of studying us long term that we have left the cradle of our home world. It's very likely, from their own experiences in the universe, they will understand exactly what we are doing. Number 2. We are moving towards becoming a machine civilization. Speaking of machine civilizations, it could well be that these are the most common end result for most species in the universe. While I'm sure some opt out, and it may be that merging with technology and leaving biology behind is simply too attractive for exocivilizations to not consider. After all, with this comes things like superintelligence, where machine or augmented biological intelligence vastly outstrips anything natural biology may be able to do. For our species, we long ago began this process of moving away from purely human. It can be said that it happened in prehistory, the moment when some piece of technology, no matter how primitive it was incorporated into the human body. You can see early examples of this with trepanned skulls, early tooth fillings and false teeth, and even tattooing, which dates deep into prehistory. From there, we began a slow transition to augmentation that arguably could someday represent a complete transformation of the species into a machine civilization. What comes in the future is anyone's guess, but that we are near the precipice between technological, biological, and definitions of what a cyborg is stands as a testament that we ourselves are an increasingly advancing exocivilization. Number 1. We will join the galactic community, or we will create it. So far, we've taken this from the perspective that there are other civilizations in the Milky Way. But in reality, we can't answer that question either way, at least right now. There may be others, or may have been others, or were the first. But in the future, there may be far more than there is now. There is some thinking that as the universe ages, an increasing amount of stars will have had time to develop life, and ultimately civilizations, leading to an explosion of civilizations late in the life of the universe. While we have no real idea other than our sampling of one, us, on just how long it takes, on average, for a habitable exoplanet to produce a civilization, we do know that there are very likely numerous planets in the galaxy capable of sustaining a civilization. There are also very likely untold numbers of suitable worlds for terraforming scattered throughout the Milky Way, and if they haven't developed life, it doesn't mean they can't be made habitable for it. But as far as biological life is concerned, there are several avenues where not only could future biological exocivilizations arise on their own, but that we as humans and colonizers of the galaxy might seed civilizations on these suitable exoplanets. These would originally be colonies of Earth, humans and animals that we put on those worlds. But as time passes, they would undoubtedly diverge from us. You could plant, for example, trees on a world, and then leave it alone for several 100 million years only to come back to find a completely different evolved ecosystem from what you originally planted. This would work for colonial civilizations as well. If they were isolated by distance and time, then a lack of real-time contact with Earth would eventually make them as alien as any actual alien civilization would be, and vice versa. We would be alien to them as well. Only through genetics could a link be made, but even then, with a full command of genetics, the creation of entirely new and unrelated organisms becomes possible by programming DNA from the ground up. If such knowledge of the origins of a civilization were to eventually be lost to time, remember we have at least billions of years left in this universe, then that civilization would be as alien as any other exo-civilization we might run across, despite having once been human. Thanks for listening. I am futurist and science fiction author John Michael Godier, host of Event Horizon, where each week on this channel we explore the mysteries of science, futurism, and the universe with long-form interviews every Thursday, and random standalone content when we run across things we think you'll enjoy. Thanks again, and see you Thursday.